The events unfold in a rocky remote area, where dwellings are scattered like wasp nests, carelessly stuck to the tree bark. Deep inside one of the caves, the main character is intently pounding something in a massive mortar. When his sister approached the young man, he sharply asked her to leave and not disturb him during such an important task. However, the girl, ignoring her brother's words, immediately plunged her dirty fingers directly into the container. The main character continued mixing the unknown potion when the sister dipped her hand into the mixture and immediately licked her finger, amazed by the incredible sweetness of the brewing elixir. Unable to tolerate such audacity, the young man decisively pushed the annoying relative away from his work table so that she would not interfere with the sacred act. After that, the healer calmly made it clear that what he was preparing was not some kind of sweet, but a healing potion. However, Li Huowan was fully aware of the futility of his words. Whatever he said to his sister, she would inevitably forget everything. They were in a cursed place, filled with stupid, mutilated monsters. One could say that all the inhabitants of this cave were nothing more than terrifying exhibits in a museum of deformities. Li Huowan did not understand why he, being in his right mind, had to languish among these miserable freaks. But at that very moment, the young man heard some noise behind his back. Turning around, the main character saw a man pressing some girl to the cold ground, not letting her break free from the iron grip. The rapist promised the victim that he would not hurt her. He just wanted to make sure of something. After these words, the guy laughed maliciously, and the entire crowd of onlookers laughed along with him. Listening to this terrible laughter and the girl's desperate resistance, Li Huowan tried until the last moment to convince himself that everything happening was just an illusion, a deception of the senses. However, in the end, he could not hold back. Grabbing his heavy mortar, instead of continuing to prepare the remedies, the young man struck the rapist on the head with a swing. No matter how much the healer tried to convince himself that everything happening to him was a lie, reality stubbornly made itself known. This man seemed too real, too tangible to him. So the young man could no longer ignore the unfolding disgrace. Immediately after the blow, the girl jumped to her feet, hastily hiding behind her savior's back. And the stunned scoundrel roared furiously, threatening Li Huowan with retribution. The villain reminded him how well the teacher treated him, and if he told the mentor about what happened, he would surely be killed. However, for the protagonist, the one called the teacher here was no less than a piece of shit. When Li Huowan said this aloud, the beaten scoundrel simply froze in place, not believing that the young man dared to so openly insult the revered mentor. Along with him, all the other inhabitants of this gloomy cave froze in silent amazement. But at that very moment, a lord in snow-white robes majestically entered the cave. The newcomer asked the crowd to stop the noise, then invited Li's brother and Wang's sister to meet the master. The protagonist's little sister smiled strangely, almost madly, and laughed crazily. The beaten rapist was extremely satisfied with what was happening, understanding that today would be the end for Li Huowan. However, the young man did not worry at all, firmly realizing that everything was happening only in his inflamed consciousness. He was not real, like all these miserable people around. While the main character was pondering this, his sister suddenly struck him hard on the forearm. Of course, the young man immediately grabbed the girl by the hand, not understanding what she wanted from him. But at that moment, the sister handed the brother something wrapped in dark cloth. It turned out to be the very same abomination they had ground up earlier. The crazy girl thought the crushed remains were sugar and offered a treat to her brother so that he would not be sad. In the end, so as not to upset her, Li Huowan still accepted that creepy gift from her hands, and the girl laughed quite a bit, enthusiastically telling the young man how kind their teacher was. If Li Huowan obediently follows the mentor, he will receive even more such treats. After these words, they calmly went into another cave, bathed in an ominous red light. The brother and sister passed by a huge stove on which stood an equally impressive cauldron. At that very moment, the master teacher himself was diligently working with his giant mortar, methodically grinding something in the vessel. First of all, upon seeing the mentor, the girl respectfully bowed, greeting the teacher. He smiled quite broadly with his insane mouth at the two who had come, noticing that these two had made him wait. Immediately after this, the old man nimbly jumped back, moving straight behind the girl who had just greeted him. Grabbing her fragile neck, the mentor immediately threw the apprentice into his huge mortar, where some unknown contents were splashing, after which the teacher laughed and began chanting a spell in a sing-song voice about how, thanks to this sacrifice, his life would be prolonged and protection would be gained. The girl, listening to these terrible words, glanced at the sweet treat she was now lying in and really wanted to try it. She kept praising the kind teacher until the edge of his heavy mortar mercilessly began to knead her body. Due to the monstrous pressure, the poor girl's eyes popped out immediately, her intestines fell out, and her arms were torn off. At the end of the spell, the teacher authoritatively ordered the furnaces to be lit to start the alchemical process. As a result, 2 huge creatures took the old man's mortar and began pouring the bloody contents into the cauldron. It immediately began to emit an unbearably foul stench, which Li Huowan desperately tried not to breathe in. The young man tried until the last moment to convince himself that this stench was just a trick of the mind, and therefore it was also unreal. At that moment, enjoying the aroma of decay, the teacher recalled that Li Huowan had called him a piece of shit, after which the old man rushed to the young man to find out if his words were true and why he had spoken so boldly. The main character kept repeating to himself all the time that what was happening to him was a lie and untrue. He squeezed his eyes shut with all his might and soon finally opened them, but no longer in that terrible place. The young man was tied hand and foot and lay somewhere in a hospital ward under the piercing beeping of various medical devices. Having calmed down and caught his breath, the guy fully realized that he had survived another nightmare. Soon, a doctor came to Li Huowan to find out everything about his latest hallucination, whether there had been any changes. However, for the most part, the patient saw the same things as always. However, the doctor noticed that this time the young man was somehow too depressed. Therefore, Li Huowan reminded him that he had once told his doctor about his younger sister in the hallucinations. This time, his balding teacher cruelly tore the girl into small pieces before his eyes and then used her remains to create an elixir. Of course, the doctor immediately made several notes on his tablet. But the main character really wanted to know how the doctor could explain what was happening to him, what these terrible hallucinations meant, what his psyche was trying to convey with them. However, the doctor thought that there was no reason to look for special meanings in such hallucinations. The patient should be more concerned about the duration of each hallucination and his mental stability. Now that he was able to get rid of the hallucinatory psychotic disorder, the young man had to remember one important rule. Everything he sees is a lie. He must not succumb to it. Moreover, when leaving, the doctor asked that Li Huowan, when encountering another hallucination, try to act based on logical thinking. Only in this way will he be able to leave the hospital as soon as possible. After the doctor left, a beautiful girl immediately appeared in the ward, greeting the main character with a warm smile. She was his childhood friend who hoped that Li Huowan would listen to the doctor's recommendations and soon be healthy. The young man's face clearly showed how happy he was to see the friend who came to visit him. And when she hastily sat down on a chair near the bed, she noticed that her friend was smiling like a real prankster. Asking him not to fool around, she immediately began rummaging through her briefcase to show what she had brought with her. It turned out to be a collection of study materials personally prepared by the teachers for the sick student. The main character was amazed that Nia Yan really intended to please him with this. They had grown up together after all. However, the girl immediately hit the young man on the head with this hefty collection, scolding him for idleness. But still, with a smile, she handed him a game console that she had brought especially for him. However, she did not immediately give the console to Li Huowan. The girl agreed to do so only on the condition that he called her little sister. And of course, the young man leaned over her face, fulfilling the condition that was necessary. Immediately after this, Nia Yan, surprised, handed the console to the boy, who was definitely glad about it. The main character immediately collapsed onto the pillow and began playing enthusiastically, talking about how boring it was to spend whole days stuck in a psychiatric hospital. Although he was not mad, he could soon become so from such confinement. However, Nyayana asked the young man not to flirt too much and to do his homework, since he had still made a promise to her. After these words, Li Huowan immediately got distracted from his console, reminding Nia Yan that he remembers the given word. After that, he propped himself up on his elbow, reminding that they would definitely enter the same university together. The young man promised the girl to definitely keep this promise, after which he hugged her tightly, and she, calmly closing her teary eyes, asked that Li Huovan recover soon, for she missed him very much. In the end, they sat like that almost until evening, so Nia Yana was already time to leave, and the main character decided to see his friend off to the gate. However, with the first steps, the young man noticed that the world before him began to suspiciously float and distort. At that moment, near his usual things, he noticed the very same cursed mortar from the nightmare. Of course, seeing the fear on his friend's face, the girlfriend immediately rushed to Li Huowan to understand what had happened to him. The guy himself was clearly slightly panicking, as he had been following the doctor's instructions all the time, but he still felt bad. But he could not worry Nia Yan, so he pretended that everything was fine and deliberately tried to scare her. And she got a little angry, reminding the hero that he needed to behave more seriously. He was not a child to scare her like that. After these words, the girl, angry, quickly headed to the door. Li Huowan looked back at the room one last time. However, the mortar had already disappeared. So the young man thought he had just imagined it. However, when he turned around and left the ward, the room began to change again before his eyes. The main hero hurried after his girlfriend, begging her not to be angry with him. He made it clear that he only wanted to fool around with her a little. At that moment, the other hospital patients looked at the young man, for some reason laughing with the same sinister laughter. The hero did not notice this. He was more worried that Nia Yan was ignoring him. However, she, of course, turning around with a smile, poked the boy in the nose and promised that she would come to visit him again next week. She asked that by that time he would feel better. After which they smiled and said goodbye to each other, and the girl hurriedly left. Li Huowan went back to his ward. Wandering through the corridors, the young man realized that he really had seen a mortar with medicines, which meant that his condition had worsened. If that was true, then he would not be able to be discharged from the hospital before the entrance exams began. Then he would not be able to enter the same university as his friend. He immediately raised his hands up, protesting the treacherous twists of fate. Only later did the boy realize that his clothes were somehow unusual. Feeling that something was in his pocket, he rummaged there, and found the very same nasty thing that the irresponsible sister from the hallucination had given him. Having tried it, the young man was convinced that it really tasted strange. However, he could not understand how what he had imagined turned out to be real. Therefore, Li Huowan immediately ran to the doctor to tell him everything. However, suddenly he stopped, pondering what was happening, and realized if there was something more in these hallucinations, this was the perfect chance for him. Soon, the young man found himself again in the world of his hallucinations, where he finally decided to talk to this crazy crowd. He wanted to find out if they had money or any valuables. After all, the healer knew that these miserable people would never be able to spend them, so they could lend the valuables to him. However, the main character understood how pointless his request was. It was unlikely that such drug addicts would have money. However, unexpectedly behind him, he heard a familiar female voice. It was the very girl he had saved. She, tugging the young man by his jacket, asked him to go with her. When they went around the corner, the rescued girl took off a small gold bracelet from her leg, after which she handed it to Li Huowan, hoping it would fit. The guy, looking at this ring, realized that although it was thin, it was quite heavy. The main thing in his case was that it was gold. Therefore, Li Huowan promised that he would take the jewelry for a short time and then definitely return it. After that, he gave the girl the very candy that his sister had given him earlier. Quite sweet. All this time, the other workers were spying on them, hoping that the girl would show them something more worthwhile than just her legs. However, while they were whispering among themselves, a young man in white robes approached them again. Not understanding why the workers had frozen, he suggested they return to their duties. And of course, everyone, seeing the internal apprentice, immediately scattered each to their own workplace. In the end, only the main character and the girl remained. Therefore, the young man immediately turned his gaze to the youth. He felt very sorry that Li Huowan did not have the honor of becoming the main ingredient for the teacher. The healer himself only sighed heavily, trying to recall the name of this guy. It seemed his name was Xuanyang. The same man demanded that Li Huowan return to work. After all, if he wasted the teacher's potion, the mentor would skin him alive. As he was leaving, the main character's gaze fell on the jade pendant hanging on Xuanyang's belt. The first thought of the youth was that this was surely a genuine antique. Therefore, obviously, the first thing he decided was to appropriate this pendant for himself. The events shifted to midnight, when the main character came to the Xuanyang's abode. Honestly, he did not even suppose that he would not be home today. After that, Li Huowan carefully examined the jade that he managed to steal. If he could take this item into the real world and sell it, it would surely be enough to pay for his and Nia Yana's university education. So, rejoicing in his find and quietly humming to himself, the young man began to descend the stairs. However, ahead he saw some light. There were clearly people there. But at that very moment, Xuanyang appeared behind him, very curious about what the healer was doing here at such a late hour. Of course, the main character, frightened, immediately recoiled from his older brother. Moreover, he was very surprised that he was wearing rags like an ordinary servant. Xuanyang himself sighed heavily, realizing that Li Huowan was lucky. After that, he went forward, explaining that they wanted to escape together from this hellish place. The outer circle disciples had already passed. Of course, the main character was surprised about what happened to those guys and why they were planning to escape. However, unexpectedly, Xuanyang pushed the young man against the wall, pressing him so that he could not move. The older brother warned, either Li Huowan follows them, or they will kill him. After all, they could not allow that leprous old man to learn about their escape. And of course, the main character began to be quite worried by such plot twists. However, he will still be able to return to the hospital whenever he wants. So a bunch of random people who appeared to him won't do anything to him. In the end, he opened his eyes and very soon found himself in the very same hospital ward. And of course, he, as usual, was still tightly bound hand and foot. At such a late hour, the nurses were surely already fast asleep. And because the young man was tied up, he could not even be sure whether the gold bracelet and the jade pendant had moved with him. Therefore, he could only return back into the hallucination and watch what would happen next. However, having moved, he realized that it seemed everyone had already left without him. Therefore, this became yet another reason for Li Huowan to be convinced that his own hallucinations could not harm him. In the end, the young man returned to his bunk and slept through the entire day along with the others. But suddenly, one of the students ran up to them, loudly shouting in an attempt to wake everyone up. He warned that the teacher wants all of them to gather in the Huey Hall. Of course, everyone, waking up immediately, began whispering about what would happen and decided to hurry so as not to anger the mentor. Li Huowan was the only one who did not ask questions, as he roughly understood what the meeting would be about. In the end, as soon as everyone gathered, the old man went out to greet the students. Looking at his disgusting appearance, the main character could only guess what the old man had planned this time. He calmly explained that last night around 3 in the morning, some people tried to escape from their temple. Among them were 2 followers of the old teacher, and surely it hurt him because of their escape. Dragging the bound bodies behind him, the old man reminded the rules of his immortal mountain school. They consisted of encouraging hard work and punishing committed mistakes. Obviously, he had to punish these people. Li Huowan, looking at the caught group, was amazed that they were caught so easily. The teacher at that moment began to recite some spell, and immediately the students started to float in the air from the unseen powers of their mentor. Soon, a huge hole opened in the middle of the hall, leading as if to the very underworld. That is where the old man threw the traitors. Of course, they resisted as much as they could. So Li Huowan felt uneasy from this sight. He tried to remind himself that everything happening to him was just a creation of his own mind, and that meant he had nothing to fear. However, suddenly behind his back, the young man heard a very real roar. Immediately after that, tentacles appeared from the cave, which then stretched across the entire hall and began to kill. What kind of tentacles are these? Li Huowan had no idea. However, he kept reminding himself that nothing inside the hallucination could harm him. However, he had never experienced such dangerous situations before. But at that very moment, the teacher reminded his students that if they had doubts, they could remember this day, and also reminded that helping the teacher achieve immortality is already a great merit. If the mentor ascends, he will never forget their kindness. But the old man was still curious why, when the traitors offered Li Huowan to escape with them, he did not do it. Feeling the nasty gaze of this old man on himself, the young man tried not to panic. Honestly, it became increasingly difficult for him to realize that what was happening around was an illusion. However, unexpectedly, the teacher patted Li Huowan on the head, praising him for his deed. He considered him a sufficiently worthy and talented young man. From this moment, the youth will become his direct disciple, and even the inner disciples will envy him. And obviously, it was not difficult to understand that along with the new status, the main character's position at school had significantly improved. However, he also understood partly this appointment was due to the fact that 4 people were injured today, so there simply were not enough working hands. At the same time, the teacher was pondering a new, more suitable name for his student. After all, since he had become a follower, it was inevitable. In the end, the old man decided to name the young man Xuanyang, since the previous Xuanyang had died, and he needed a replacement. After this, a small pouch with 5 magical potions also flew into Li Huowan's hands. These potions were made personally by the teacher. Their use extended the young man's life by 10 years, and they could also give him strength capable of saving his life. After that, the mentor loudly explained to the others gathered that resisting the teacher's path was useless. However, anyone who helps the teacher will eventually be rewarded, and the reward will be very generous. Li Huowan said nothing, looking at the potions in his hands and realizing that these blood-red pills were indeed made from other people. When he finally came to, he found in his pockets everything he managed to carry from that dreadful world. All that remained for him now was to verify the authenticity of the gold bracelet and the jade pendant. However, obviously, if the material of the jewelry was genuine, then probably the potions were authentic as well. Therefore, the main character even wanted to try them. While he was pondering this, suddenly a very angry Nyayana burst into the room. After a call from a friend, she had to skip classes and rush to him urgently. Therefore, the girl hoped that it was worth such efforts, and even warned, if his call turned out to be a joke, he would be in trouble. However, after pushing her into the ward, the young man hastily closed the doors and drew the curtains so that no one could enter them. Of course, Nyayana was extremely embarrassed, not understanding such secrecy. After all, the nurses could suspect something. It turned out that there was wiretapping in the psychiatric hospital rooms. So the nurse hastily announced over the loudspeaker that they would not be listening to them, and the couple could continue. At that very moment, the main character handed his friend what he had been hiding in his hands all this time. And afterwards, as if nothing had happened, he asked the sisters not to be so curious and to better pay extra attention to the intensive care unit. At that time, the girl saw the jade pendant that the young man placed in her hands. However, the guy hastily asked her not to say anything and to listen to him carefully. After that, he said everything that was necessary, and with that, they said goodbye for a few more agonizing days. Unfortunately, the people outside whom the boy trusted all thought that he had completely lost his mind. All he had left was to hope for his little sister. Only she could listen to him. So Li Huowan hoped that Nyayana would really believe him. Soon he heard an announcement over the loudspeaker that Nyayana had come to visit him. Of course, Li Huowan immediately rejoiced and jumped out of bed to meet her. He could not believe his luck that the girl trusted him and still came back. However, when the young man stepped into the corridor, he saw 3 men in uniform walking down the gloomy corridors somewhere far away. Of course, Li Huowan wanted to find out what they were doing here and where they were heading. However, the officer asked the protagonist to close the door of his ward and not to run outside. He also asked to be informed if he suddenly met the old man. After all, he had secretly escaped from the ward again and was now being searched for everywhere. The hero, of course, obediently closed the door. However, he did not understand how the old man managed to escape from the intensive care ward. After all, he was a decrepit old man. Nothing more. At all costs, he urgently needed to meet with his girlfriend. They met outside the hospital walls, where Nyayan revealed what she had found out about the jade pendant and the gold bracelet. That pendant turned out to be incredibly ancient. It was valued at more than 400,000. The gold bracelet also turned out to be genuine, an authentic antique. In the end, the protagonist rejoiced because he was right. He was not crazy. After that, he joyfully lifted the girl, marveling at the fact that he was actually healthy, and not noticing that at that moment her appearance began to change, distort. Li Huowan, seeing his girlfriend off, was glad that his findings were genuine. This meant that he would not recover from hallucinations anytime soon, but at the same time his girlfriend could finally become a wealthy lady. However, she only got angry and hit the young man for saying such nonsense. Still, she did not need any money. The boy's health was more important to her than any abilities. Therefore, she hoped that he would not stop the treatment because of this. Otherwise, she would no longer help him. In the end, the main character gave his promise, and the matter was settled. But suddenly, some old man appeared behind them. He immediately knocked the girl down onto the cold ground and held her tightly, not allowing her to get up. Of course, the frightened Li Huowan immediately rushed to his friend, demanding that the old man release her at once. However, suddenly something heavy flew straight into his forehead with force, causing the impact site to start bleeding immediately. The young man fell to the ground, losing consciousness for a moment. He could only weakly demand that the old man stop and immediately release Nyayana. And at that moment he remembered the teacher's words. The use of the elixir not only prolonged life, but also gave strength that could one day greatly help Li Huowan. At that time, the frightened Nyayana was crying, glancing at her friend and hoping that he was still alive. However, suddenly the girl noticed that he was eating some bloody red pills right before her eyes. Immediately after that, the young man stood up as if nothing had happened, radiating some incredibly strong energy. After that, he rushed forward, throwing the old man away from his girlfriend. He struck him with monstrous force, hitting his head against the ground, causing blood to immediately appear. And Li Huowan himself, smiling somewhat madly, reminded the man that he should have simply stopped when politely asked to do so. However, obviously, after what happened, the young man was locked in a cell for especially dangerous patients. He begged his doctor to release him, since everything he did was to protect his girlfriend. The old man attacked them first. However, the doctor could not call it mere self-defense. It resembled an attempted murder under the guise of self-defense. Moreover, he was very curious how his ward could inflict such pain on another person. Ordinary people are not capable of that. Of course, the protagonist immediately tried to find some justification for his actions, and the doctor demanded that he be sincere in his answers, as he hated most when his patients lied to him. And of course, Li Huowan did not know what to do. Surely the man would not believe that he had taken a miraculous elixir. In the end, the young man had no choice left, so he slowly began to lose consciousness. And, finding himself in a familiar place, he realized that he had found a rather peculiar working method for solving his own problems. Somewhere at the same time, the teacher was praying in the Holy Squad, glorifying those saints who laid the foundation of all beginnings. They rose up to carry with them the burden of the fallen and to bestow upon them all kinds of honors, singing their sacred names. While they were praying together, the teacher turned to Li Huowan, who now bore the name Xuanyang. The young man in white robes had just joined their temple, and he still had much to understand. After that, the old man appointed one of the disciples as the mentor of the main character so that he could teach him everything. Now, with the prayer finished and nothing left to do, the teacher suggested they go for a modest dinner. At the same time, Li Huowan glanced at the man who was staring at him so intently from the dark shadows. Already, as they were descending the stone stairs, the main character's mentor explained that the man next to their teacher was the elder brother. Since the other two elder brothers tried to escape, that man was now the only remaining inner disciple of the master. Also, of course, the mentor asked that from now on Li Huowan show proper respect to everyone he met within the ancient walls of the temple. However, the hero himself was more interested in what he should do now that he had become a true disciple. Since the master took Li Huowan as his disciple and appointed him to manage the warehouse, that was his main occupation. However, if the young man wished for the master to teach him the path of immortality, he was still very far from it. And obviously, Xuanyang was quite interested in the path to immortality, which his mentor had just told him about. Therefore, he had to explain that their teacher truly possessed incredible, almost divine power. However, not everyone could learn the methods to achieve immortality. Most likely, only inner disciples could succeed. Yet even such a faint hope greatly pleased the main character. So he realized this place was not so bad after all. Now he needed to try to pull out as much money and power from here as possible. Soon all the senior disciples gathered in the alchemy hall of the temple. They all recited a prayer until finally the huge cauldron opened and pills appeared from it. These were the very same blood-red pills that the old man had previously given to his new disciple. Looking at this ominous sight, the main character realized how foolish he had been. All this time he had been thinking about how to make money, but his thinking was too narrow. If he could bring his teacher's abilities into the real world, then he would become incredibly strong and rich. Suddenly, while he was admiring what was happening, the teacher called Zhuanyan by name. Of course, the main character assumed that he was about to be assigned something, and he decided to play along with the old man in order to find a way to achieve his goals faster. Since Zhuanyan was now the warehouse manager, the old man ordered him to go and bring an ingredient called Bai Lin Miao. It was the name of the girl whom he had recently saved, and in return she handed him her golden amulet. Obviously, the young man was stunned, as he did not want to lead her to the slaughter, and the old man immediately rushed to Li Huowan, believing that he was ignoring his order. In the end, the guy had no other choice but to simply escape from this nightmare world back to reality. When he came to, he saw his doctor, and next to him was his mother. Of course, the boy was curious about what his mother was doing here. However, she had come to visit her son and was very saddened to see his head wrapped in bandages. However, Li Huowan hastened to calm the frightened mother. After all, he was not in any pain. Then the woman, looking at the child, lamented how much he had wasted away and thought that the hospital was feeding him poorly. Therefore, she brought the boy his favorite milky grapes and decided to feed him. Of course, the main character did not want her to strain herself so much. After all, mothers rarely managed to visit him, so he just wanted her to stay close to him. She was glad that the boy had finally come to, but in any case, she needed to go to a meeting with the family of the old man who attacked her son. And the doctor only urged her on, for the family of the injured patient had been waiting for her for a long time. But the woman still wanted to spend a little more time with her son. At that moment, the frightened boy continued to prove to his mother that he had done nothing wrong. He was defending himself from the old man who attacked his girlfriend. However, the woman already knew perfectly well everything that had happened on that ill-fated day. Therefore, she only showed her son a clenched fist, a sign of strength and determination, and asked him not to worry about anything. After all, Mom would stand by him until the very end. After that, the woman warmly said goodbye to her son and decided to leave the ward. At the last moment, she only asked the boy to obey the doctor unconditionally and not to forget to take the prescribed medicines. The main character knew his mother well, and therefore understood. Surely at that meeting, she would simply tear everyone to shreds. However, unfortunately, at that very moment, the young man began to fall back into that nightmarish world of hallucinations. In the short time he had been in reality, the boy had not even managed to think of a way to deceive that sinister old man. At the same time, after the woman left, the doctor wanted to calmly continue the conversation with the patient. However, he began to lose consciousness again. When the young man woke up, it turned out that the cursed old man had been patiently waiting for his awakening all this time. Seeing the madman, the main character only wanted to find out what they had done to that unfortunate girl. However, unexpectedly, the teacher immediately shoved some disgusting tentacles right inside him, widely opening his mouth. The hero, who had just come to his senses, had no idea what was actually in his mouth. The old man calmly explained to the boy that he needed to hold the contents firmly in his throat and under no circumstances open his mouth. Otherwise, it would be impossible to swallow the black taisu. This very black taisu was now imprisoned in some kind of box, tied with scarlet threads and hung with many protective amulets. The mentor explained to the youth that the black taisu was a very valuable item. Li Huowan only needed to swallow it and allow the tentacles to suppress the raging hysteria. However, of course, the main hero immediately grabbed those disgusting tentacles and desperately began pulling them out of his mouth. He tried to explain to his mentor that he was not suffering from any hysteria at all. However, the mentor was not going to listen to the boy and immediately turned to his two loyal disciples. In the end, they drew their cold blades, mercilessly pinning the youth to the ground. Meanwhile, the teacher made it clear to the guy that it was not up to him to decide whether he wanted to absorb those tentacles or not. However, for Li Huowan himself, all this was pure nonsense, because in this life, only he himself made decisions. After that, the guy broke free from this nightmare, returning once again to the real world. There, the worried Naya Yan was already waiting for him, wanting to find out what had happened to her friend, because he looked incredibly frightened. A doctor was also present in the ward, who quickly guessed that the patient was experiencing hallucinations. The medic was clearly worried that the visions had become more frequent lately. Going over everything in his head, the main character realized that these cursed hallucinations had not yet completely left him. He asked the doctor to prescribe him some medicine that could temporarily suppress the hallucinations. The boy was tired of them and desperately wanted at least a little rest. In the end, the man agreed to prescribe the young man the very medicine he had taken last time. But as he was leaving, he reminded Li Huowan that this medicine was only a temporary measure. If he wanted to fully recover, he needed to continue following the main treatment method. At that moment, the girl rummaged through the room and found the remaining pills, immediately handing them to the main character along with a glass of water. He did not want to bother his friend, so he asked her to give him only the medicine. At the very moment the young man swallowed it, the very same disgusting tentacles appeared in her hands, which he would never want to consume. As soon as the guy took the pills, he was glad that he would now be safe, because under the influence of the medicine, the hallucinations no longer manifested. Nyayana was clearly worried about her friend's condition and wanted to find out what was happening to him in his visions. The main character began to explain that the old man from the other side was telling him some strange things. He claimed that the young man had hysteria and wanted to feed him some kind of creepy creature. Over time, Li Huowan even began to think that this modern life was a hallucination, and not the other one. However, he tried not to give in to such thoughts until he saw tentacles coming out of his own mouth. In the end, they started to crawl out more and more, eerily covering his entire face. And of course, the boy panicked because he had just taken the medicine and the illusion appeared again. The young man tried simply to gather his strength and open his eyes again so that all the damned hallucinations would disappear once and for all. However, unfortunately, he woke up already on the other side. The teacher was clearly annoyed that just a minute ago this stubborn boy refused to consume anything, and now he almost swallowed Black Taisu whole. But since the hysteria had passed, the young man could return to work because their temple did not like idlers and lazy people. Therefore, the old man suggested that Li Huowan come to him on the first day of each month so that he could be given the next dose of medicine. Thus, the boy gradually began to come to his senses, horrified to realize that the nightmare place he was in was the true reality. And this meant that Nyayana and everything he experienced in that other life was actually a lie and deception. The boy could not believe it. He desperately tried to scratch off the disgusting tentacles that had lodged in his body because he did not want to accept the fact that Nyayana was only an illusion. Soon, from all the memories and filth he had swallowed, the young man began to vomit violently. And at that very moment, he heard the familiar voice of Nyayana next to him. She appeared to her friend in the form of a snow-white spirit. Of course, as soon as Li Huowan saw her, he immediately began to beg the girl not to leave and to stay with him. However, when he raised a look full of despair at her and saw that the ghostly silhouette was already dissolving into the air, the young man fearfully reached out his hands to her. But he didn't make it in time. The silhouette completely vanished into the void. After that, the main character was tormented by only one painful question. Why did he end up in this damn place? Moreover, he wanted to know, had he really gone mad? And what, after all, was happening to him? However, soon he returned to the very cave where all the others were working. The white-haired girl hurried to bring the young man some food. She wanted him to eat at least a pastry. After all, he hadn't really eaten anything properly today. The main character all this time was examining the jade pendant in his hands, wanting to understand where it had come from. The girl explained that this pendant was given to her by the elder brother Wang himself. She asked him not to give her such an expensive thing, but he insisted that she accept it. After these words, Li Huowan laughed loudly, almost madly, and shouted that he was not crazy at all. Then the young man suddenly felt very ill, and elder brother Wang struck him on the head with a heavy stone. It turned out that all of this completely repeated the scene when the main hero rushed to save Nia Yan from the mad old man. Right after Brother Van considered Li Huowan dead, he went after the girl to finish her off as well. The guy immediately dashed to her, wanting to find out where that person was now. However, Brother Van was killed. The main hero beat him to death with his own hands. But in that reality, which he saw at that moment while protecting Nia Yan, the young man was fighting the old man. Brother Van was not there at all. And this could only mean one thing. He had truly gone completely mad without realizing it himself. With this bitter realization, the main hero returned to his work as a master's apprentice. Looking at all the blood being washed off the huge cauldron, he realized this world was real, and that meant everyone he knew in this cursed world would definitely die. Obviously, the one to blame was that cursed old man who so desperately desired to gain immortality. At that moment, at Zhuanyan's call, the mentor himself appeared behind him. He thought the young man had been overthinking too much lately. Of course, the guy immediately bowed respectfully, greeting the teacher, not even noticing when he had arrived here. However, the old man demanded that the apprentice tell what he really desired. Of course, bowing even lower, the main character immediately began to invent an excuse for himself. The best he could come up with was that he was impressed by the teacher's alchemy skills. The young man wondered if he could ever achieve such mastery. Obviously, everyone who heard these words clearly understood that this flattery was far too low grade. However, the teacher was very pleased with the apprentice's eagerness. He was glad for such motivation, and all present were amazed. The old man clearly believed this crude praise. The Mad Master himself explained that he wanted to teach his students the art of alchemy. However, creating the elixir of immortality is a process far from as simple as it might seem at first glance. Ordinary potions are quite easy to create, but to achieve true immortality, one must master both internal and external alchemy skillfully. Of course, Li Huowan decided to find out how soon the master would reach the coveted immortality. Although in his heart he desperately hoped that he would perish soon. The madman made it clear that becoming immortal is not an easy matter. However, he had every chance of achieving it. After that, the old man decided to tell the young man why his chances were so great. However, the assistant distracted the teacher, explaining that they did not have much time left. If they did not prepare everything for the ceremony now, it would be too late. Therefore, there was no choice. The man authoritatively ordered to begin the necessary preparations. The subordinate respectfully bowed in the same way, after which he sent the main character to the warehouse to bring the ingredients they needed. Because of yesterday's hysteria, the healer was unable to follow the teacher's order and did not bring Bai Lin Miao here, which prevented the old man from engaging in alchemy. As is known, the quality of the ingredients, as well as the time of preparing the elixir, directly affect the quality of the final product. Therefore, the man demanded that the boy hurry and complete the task. Only then did Li Huowan realize that the problem with using Bai Lin Miao had not been resolved. In the end, whether he wanted to or not, the young man had to go to the temple warehouse. Everyone immediately became alert when Li Huowan came to choose a new ingredient. However, the main character clearly understood. Escaping from here would not be possible, and they would all die sooner or later. However, the healer's choice fell on Bai Lin Miao, so he asked her to go with him. She, of course, calmly agreed without resistance. Only when they were walking through the gloomy corridors did the girl ask the young man to send a message to her family if he managed to get out alive. Her parents lived at the foot of Mount Nyushan in the Lianguo district. Crying, she asked to convey apologies to them for their daughter not being able to take care of them in old age. However, Li Huowan made it clear that he would not be able to help her with that. The girl did not have much time left. After that, he drew the sword he had hidden in his sleeve and ordered Bai Lin Miao to undress immediately. Obviously, she began to cry, not understanding what this madman intended to do to her. Soon, Zhuanyang brought the girl and presented her to the teacher as a necessary ingredient for the potion. The man laughed and thanked the senior student for successfully completing the task. After that, the old man used his powers to pull the girl towards himself. In the end, the mentor pulled her directly to himself. However, he immediately felt something strange. The protagonist cut the girl's legs in such a way as to give the impression that she had started her menstruation. Of course, the mentor was extremely displeased that this happened right now, because due to this unfortunate circumstance, all the properties of the precious ingredient completely changed and were hopelessly ruined. So the old man disdainfully threw the girl away and authoritatively ordered to return this worthless ingredient back to the warehouse. And of course, without showing his joy, Li Huowan rejoiced inwardly and wanted to quickly take the rescued girl far away from this cursed place. However, his master stopped him because he clearly understood that since this ingredient was hopelessly spoiled, the student needed to bring another one. The old man knew that there was another white ingredient in the warehouse, so he mercilessly ordered to return because the sacred alchemical processes could no longer be postponed. In the end, returning back to the gloomy storage, the young man took another white ingredient for the insatiable teacher. He desperately bowed before the main character, begging the elder brother not to take him away. After all, he did not want to die in this underworld. And only then did Li Huowan realize what a fatal mistake he had made. In the end, he failed to save anyone from a terrible fate on that ill-fated day. The master continued making his sinister elixir, ordering the student to carefully observe every one of his movements if he truly wished to learn the thorny path of immortality. While that cursed freak kept brewing his dreadful potions, Li Huowan could not save anyone. So tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, every single day innocent people would perish, being processed into another vile medicine. And of course, the healer did not want to become an accomplice in the murder of innocent souls. When the elixir was finally ready, the master immediately broke into a satisfied grin and praised his student. The young man was very determined, even compared to the other followers. Therefore, the old man generously handed him one of the precious pills as a reward for his diligent work. When the elixir was in his hands, the main character began to realize, to save himself and the other unfortunate people, he had only one option left, to finish off this madman. However, when he took the elixir, he realized that something incredibly strange was happening to him. His whole body began to burn with an unbearable internal fire, evaporating the fluids of the young man's body. The teacher calmly asked him to go and rest well. The student had just taken a very powerful elixir, and for its full acceptance, the body needed time to adapt. In the end, finding himself in a dark cave and almost naked, the main character desperately tried to refresh himself somehow and cool his burning flesh. The power of the elixir was truly incredible. Now the young man could effortlessly break a huge stone wall with one hand. He remembered until the very end the pleas of that old man who begged not to be killed. And the bitter realization that Li Huowan had indeed drunk the potion made from torn human bodies gave him no peace. Moreover, the boy did not understand how he could kill that degenerate who had swallowed countless similar powerful elixirs over the many years of his existence. At that very moment, to visit his older brother, Bai Lin Miao timidly approached him, trying in some way to help him and ease his suffering. However, the girl saw that the young man was tormented not only by excruciating physical pain, but also by unbearable emotional anguish. Understanding this, she asked him to stop blaming himself. After all, he simply had no other choice in this nightmarish situation. However, then she decided with all seriousness to ask the boy, did he want to defeat that mad degenerate? And of course, Li Huowan was surprised that she herself decided to speak about such a dangerous topic. He immediately pressed the girl against the cold stone wall and scolded her for such careless words. They could be heard, and then both would be killed immediately. However, Bai Lin Miao knew there was nothing to worry about. Today was exactly the day when Master Yu goes to the great market, so he definitely would not hear their secret conversation. Of course, Li Huowan had no idea who this mysterious Master Yu was at all. However, at that moment, all the ingredient slaves who had gathered at the raised noise were already looking at the healer with undisguised horror and distrust. This was not surprising. After all, now everyone considered him a faithful accomplice of that cursed old man. So, grabbing Bai Lin Miao by her fragile hand, the young man immediately led her away to find a more secluded place for their dangerous conversation. And one of the workers was far too wary and suspicious of these two leaving. Already dressed, the main character decided to find out from his friend who this mysterious Master Yu was. However, she herself did not really know who he was. He could neither be seen nor touched. Grandfather said that only truly highly spiritual people are capable of giving him orders. However, on the 1st and 15th of each month, he invariably returns to the great fair. From all this, it followed that during these 2 precious days, the cursed master could not watch every secluded corner of this vast temple. This was truly invaluable information for planning an escape. However, the girl was much more eager to learn something more important. Whether the hero really wanted to defeat the teacher, he honestly admitted that he wanted to tear him into small bloody pieces. Delighted by such an answer, Bai Lin Miao immediately made it clear that the elder brother could rely on her in this dangerous matter. She was ready to help him with all her might. However, unexpectedly, another young man quietly sneaked up to them, who also longed to help them in this risky enterprise. However, seeing the frightened and wary glances of Bai Lin Miao and Li Huowan, he realized that it seemed they simply did not remember him. This boy had no name from birth, so he asked to be called simply Gova, which stood for puppy. After that, he handed the 2 of them hot steamed buns and asked them to eat before they cooled down completely. However, Bai Lin Miao was relentlessly angry that Gova shamelessly eavesdropped on their secret conversation. Of course, he hastened to explain that he came here only because he wanted to ask his older brother for protection, but accidentally overheard the last words of Bai Lin Miao's little sister. However, obviously, the girl made it clear with all seriousness that they had no reason to trust Gova. But he persistently insisted that the older brother Li Huowan was his true ideal and idol. He desperately wanted to help their daring plan. Wasn't that enough for trust? And the boy, recalling Xuan Yan, the former bearer of his current name, understood that most likely their group of fugitives was formed in a similar way. However, he was curious why Gova was not afraid of him, despite the reputation as an accomplice of the teacher. However, he only smiled radiantly, for he perfectly understood Li Huowan was doing all this not because he had no other choice, but by the command of his own heart. After these sincere words, the main character allowed the boy to join their dangerous company, and also asked that he would not regret his decision. After all, no one knew whether he would die as ingloriously as Zhuanyan. After that, the main character spent several agonizing days searching for a way to kill a man who had consumed such an incredible amount of powerful elixirs. But managing it with only 3 seemed an almost impossible task. During all this cursed time, he repeatedly brought unfortunate ingredients from the warehouse to the teacher's alchemical laboratory. All the young man could do now was to carefully preserve in his soul their last desperate words and pleas for mercy. However, this continued only until it was time for the 8th elixir. Appearing again and bowing respectfully, Li Huowan reported to the teacher that the necessary ingredient had already been fully prepared. First of all, the Mad Master smiled broadly and praised Xuanyan for performing his work so flawlessly. And, as he had repeatedly said before, good work has always been rewarded, and mistakes punished harshly. And since this student so strongly wished to learn how to prepare immortal elixirs, the teacher decided to instruct him right now. Therefore, the old man suggested starting work with the recipe for the blood elixir. The recipe for the potion was quite simple and straightforward. However, the master strongly urged not to underestimate the importance of what was happening. After all, this recipe for immortality was taken from the most sacred book of the Celestials. The young man needed to carefully remember what he would require. By the time the protagonist had written everything down thoroughly, the time was already recorded as 3 o'clock in the morning. So this was the perfect hour to begin the sacred ritual. In the end, while the teacher solemnly recited ancient prayers and drew something mysterious on his tattered robe, the young man silently observed the process. When the old man finished, the Mad Master explained in detail that after mixing the ingredients, the elixir must be kept on a low, barely warm fire, and at 6 o'clock in the morning the next day the potion would be fully ready for use. In the end, Li Huowan hurried to explain to the teacher that he had already recorded everything down to the smallest detail on his robe. He respectfully asked the mentor to double-check his work for possible errors. However, suddenly the old man swiftly lunged at the young man and with all his withered strength kicked him in the face with his bony leg. Flying backward and crashing full force into the stone wall, Li Huowanu could only guess what was wrong with that cursed old man. Why did he suddenly get so angry at him? Obviously, although the handwriting of the main character was not very elegant, it was at least quite legible. And yet the old man didn't even glance at his writing. Most likely he simply didn't like how the boy behaved while making those notes. However, suddenly Li Huawanu recalled an important detail. They had no written scrolls during the morning lessons. In fact, throughout the entire vast temple, he hadn't seen a single calligraphic inscription. All knowledge was passed here exclusively orally, from mouth to mouth. So this led to a startling thought. The old man simply couldn't write, and was completely illiterate. Therefore, if this was true, the main character desperately wanted to know who had read to him that legendary book of the Celestials, which the master mentioned so often. While the young man lay on the cold floor, regaining consciousness after the brutal blow, another senior disciple approached him. Honestly, he was genuinely amazed that the teacher was willing to pass the sacred knowledge from the book of the Celestials to a newcomer. This meant that Li Huawanu really was much more liked by the mentor than the others. The boy himself hurried to explain to the senior disciple that the master simply adored him as a diligent student. And even if the mentor decided to pass absolutely all the knowledge from the Book of the Celestials to him, the senior disciple could in no way influence or interfere with this. After that, he decided to respectfully bow, for he needed to prepare ingredients for the teacher for the next important elixir. However, as he was about to leave, the senior disciple treacherously attacked the boy from behind. Hot blood immediately poured from his mouth. It felt like all his ribs had shattered into tiny fragments in an instant. The senior student was furious that Li Huawan had just learned the elixir recipe and was already acting so arrogantly in front of the others. He was simply boiling with rage that the teacher had taught the recipe to this upstart instead of him. Moreover, he did not forget to ominously warn that Li Huawan should not even think about telling the master about this clash between them, for the senior disciple had remained loyal to the mentor much longer than this novice could even speak. However, Li Huawan only laughed calmly and contemptuously, understanding that, it seemed, the talent for cultivation in the elder brother was not so great. Otherwise, the question would remain open. Why, after so many long years, the teacher did not even begin to teach him the true art of immortality? Obviously, immediately after these scathing words, maddened with anger, the senior disciple fiercely attacked the degenerate again. In the end, the main character with such monstrous strength crashed into the stone wall that it immediately shattered into small splinters and fragments. It is unknown how much agonizing time passed before the wounded youth was found by the mentor himself. Indignant at his disobedience and recklessness, the old man was still glad that the boy had drunk that very powerful elixir prepared by the teacher. Otherwise, he would surely have died long ago from the wounds received. Lifting the main character from the cold ground, the master admonishingly reminded him that he should treat his elder brothers with due respect and reverence, and that he should not provoke them so boldly to righteous anger. However, Li Huawan himself was extremely curious why his elder brother did not kill him on the spot, but he thought that if disciples began to die in the temple, the senior disciple would not hold his position for long. Surely this coward was simply afraid of the mysterious Master Yu, who tirelessly watched everything happening in the temple. However, it was obvious that the mentor had no idea who this mysterious Master Yu was. And of course, Li Huawan was genuinely surprised that even the mentor knew nothing about it. Although if you think carefully, for the daring escape, Xuan Yang also chose neither the first nor the 15th day of the month. Moreover, this mad old man did not teach his disciples the art of immortality. Perhaps he himself could not believe that such miserable creatures as they could be taught anything. At that moment, pondering all this, the main character began quietly giggling to himself. The mentor was extremely worried. Why had the boy gone mad even after the healing medicine from their teacher? However, in reality, Li Huawan was simply glad that he had finally made a real breakthrough in understanding the situation. After that, the young man met again with his older brother to tell him about the mysterious owner, Yu. Seeing the expression on his pale face, it became completely clear. Something important was about to happen. In the end, Li Huawan tried to secretly follow him, but he only continued diligently studying the sciences of immortality as if following a memorized pattern. And so, just as the healer was about to admit that the elder brother was not so power-hungry after all, the 15th of February arrived. While the teacher was carefully cleaning the huge cauldrons for preparing elixirs, the elder brother still did not come to the mandatory classes. Therefore, the main character stealthily sneaked into the Qingfeng Palace, the teacher's private chambers. The doors to his chambers were wide open. So, it seems, the senior student found himself loyal helpers to check everything on his behalf. However, he was a true paranoiac. Even now, he constantly looked around and was on guard. At last, the renowned disciple calmly stepped out of the chambers, bearing almost the same name as the main character Zhuan Yin. They talked quietly and at length about something when he left the teacher's chamber. After that, both took the mysterious amulets, with the help of which they instantly moved away from the palace. Of course, the healer was glad that they finally left. The senior apprentice, together with his buddy, had surely set protective spells on the room. However, Li Huowan did not know exactly which charms they used. The main thing was that now it was his turn to go inside and search everything thoroughly. Inside, there was a real stench. It smelled of the foul odor of that half-dead old man. The dwelling itself was absolutely empty inside, except for a single small nightstand standing in a dark corner. On this modest nightstand rested an ancient stone tablet covered with many strange seals. So Li Huowan assumed that this was the very legendary heavenly book that the old man mentioned so often. It was written there. And then the sound of cheerful footsteps of the Gandharva was heard, which like a huge cloud covered everything with its shadow. A beautiful body, the gateway to the world and freedom for all. However, this book resembled more a simple sacred scripture or philosophical treatise. There were no specific instructions for making elixirs. So the young man was extremely curious. How did the crazy old man know this recipe? However, suddenly behind him, a small ghostly portal silently opened. The entity that emerged from there assumed that the main character was in cahoots with that person. Therefore, it authoritatively ordered him not to move, because if she just rang the bell, the father would immediately come to her. Finally seeing this strange entity in person, Li Huowan understood what was going on. Therefore, without a trace of fear, he suggested that she ring the old man. It was high time to find out that he had completely misunderstood the heavenly book and that everything the spirit told him was a brazen lie. Of course, the spirit in the vase panicked terribly, not understanding how the young man uncovered his cunning lie. In fact, the healer was merely guessing and bluffing, but in the end understood who had misinterpreted the old man's mysterious little book. The girl spirit in the vase herself believed she was not guilty of anything. She herself could hardly understand this silly, confusing book, but her father constantly forced her to read everything for him. She was not worried at all that he would uncover the lie. After all, her father could not read anyway, so he would believe any word she said. From this involuntary story, it was easy to understand that the girl had invented the elixir recipes herself. It turned out she had read something similar in another book and remembered it. So she told her father that this exact recipe was written in the sacred book of the Celestials. She asked Li Huowan not to worry. After all, consuming the elixir did not kill anyone. She would not wish death upon her own father. All she feared was that if he learned the truth, he would decide she was useless. However, Li Huowan, enraged by what he heard, grabbed the cursed girl spirit in the vase and immediately smashed the vessel with all his might against the stone floor. Obviously, the spirit immediately screamed from unbearable pain. But the healer reminded her of her own words, that consuming the elixir did not kill anyone. However, it was precisely because of her invented recipes, that the cursed old man had been devouring other innocent people all this time for no reason. However, the girl spirit no longer heard his angry words. Her ghostly body, which until then had been firmly attached to the vase, began rapidly disintegrating into various organs. She experienced unprecedented, unbearable pain. Soon Li Huowan, together with the other obedient disciples, returned to the main temple to conduct the evening prayer. However, Very soon the young man literally felt with his back that something terrible was slowly approaching them. And at this ominous moment, a mad old man appeared, carrying in his bony hands the severed head of his deceased little daughter. He wanted to know who among the disciples dared to invade his house while he was preparing the sacred elixir. However, since no one even turned around, he quickly realized that no one wished to confess. Then the master decided that the best option would be to personally question each of the disciples separately. He approached 2 senior disciples to find out what they had been doing while the elixir was being prepared. The first of them hurriedly explained that according to the master's strict instructions, they had tirelessly guarded the gates of the Qingfeng temple. Under the piercing, scorching gaze of the master, he became incredibly frightened. So stammering, he explained that they had not been distracted from their assigned task for a moment. Immediately after this, the old man slowly approached the mentor Xuanyan to interrogate him as well. He hastily told what he had been doing. Li Huowan perfectly understood that he himself would simply be next for interrogation. At this tense moment, the only one who desperately trembled with his whole body was Gova, who could not find a place for himself from fear. Finally, the cue of the mad old man reached even Li Huowan himself. The old man coldly demanded that the boy tell where he went today after delivering the necessary ingredients. He hastily explained that, as an obedient apprentice, he had been in the warehouse all the time, diligently preparing materials for the next crafting ritual. The young man tried with all his might to maintain outward calm, but the sinister presence of the old man was so oppressive that it was no surprise. All present suddenly broke into a sweat when he came closer. At that moment, the master wanted someone to confirm Li Huowan's words. Was he really in the warehouse the whole time? And obviously, an oppressive, pitch-black silence immediately followed. The teacher then asked everyone to think carefully before answering. If someone helped him catch the audacious offender, they would not only go home alive and unharmed, but also receive a generous reward from him. The first to speak was Bai Lin Miao, who resolutely confirmed that the elder brother had indeed been with them the whole time. She was even ready to vouch for him with her own life. And honestly, the master was quite surprised by such selflessness. However, he still decided to question the other witnesses about it. And immediately Gua stepped forward boldly, respectfully asking that Grandfather Immortal give him his word. However, the most surprising thing is that he claimed Li Huowan did not appear in the warehouse even once today. And of course, the indignant Bai Lin Miao and Li Huowan immediately looked at the traitor with undisguised suspicion and fury. And Gua joyfully and obsequiously reported that he was happy to help Master catch the criminal, hoping that now he would generously send him home. However, the Master only got angry at this brazen lie. After all, this morning Xuanyang personally brought him the necessary ingredients. If he had not been in the warehouse even once, he simply could not have gotten them from there. Therefore, the old man believed that he wanted death, since he began to slander another student. And of course, Gua immediately fell to trembling knees and began begging Grandpa Immortal for mercy, tearfully admitting that he was too blinded by greedy desire to receive a reward, and even lied. At that very moment, an oppressive silence fell. Only one person was looking slyly and maliciously towards the main character, as if rejoicing that suspicion had fallen on him. And at this ominous moment, the old man, grabbing the bloodied body of his daughter, threw it right into that person's distorted face. He was extremely curious about why the man was so happy when Xuanyang was being framed. After that, he approached so close that even a strong adult man began to tremble like a leaf in the bathhouse from his deadly energy and fell to the cold ground. He immediately began desperately justifying himself to the master, claiming he was innocent. After that, he cowardly shifted all the blame onto his older brother, who supposedly forced him to invade the teacher's sacred house. Obviously, immediately after he was treacherously caught red-handed, the older brother realized he was in trouble. He was the same one who rushed to run away in pathetic hopes of saving his worthless life. And the master instantly understood who the true culprit was and realized that he should have guessed earlier who the traitor was. This guy was the only one capable of removing the protective spells in his house. However, the old man found it quite foolish that he thought he could calmly walk through his chambers whenever he pleased. Immediately after that, the master took out a blood-stained coin, threw it onto the stone floor, and mercilessly crushed it with his withered foot. An identical coin, which at that time was sewn under the traitor's skin, began to emit deadly energy, and in the end, in one terrible moment, he lost all 4 of his limbs. But despite this, he continued to crawl, writhing and apologizing, falling prostrate before the teacher for his unforgivable mistake. He desperately reminded the master that when the members of the cursed Jengden sect attacked them, 2 of his brothers heroically sacrificed themselves to save their clan. And in principle, the old man gradually began to understand what his student was hinting at. He tearfully began to explain to his teacher that he was too helpless and wanted to become stronger, for which he begged for mercy. However, the teacher only contemptuously stepped on his head, mercilessly pressing it to the hard ground, after which he coldly said that both him as a student and his brothers were merely wild dogs that could not be tamed. With these cruel words, he crushed his head into bloody splinters with his feet. Soon Li Huowan was solemnly led to the ancient prayer altar. He lit incense sticks and began to bow respectfully. Finally, the young man recited the sacred prayer, then looked at the teacher to understand what to do next. The master calmly and solemnly explained that after Li Huowan offered incense to the ancestors, he would become his inner disciple. Everyone immediately bowed low and began to congratulate Brother Shin on his high promotion. Finally, when all formalities were completed, the master ordered Xuanyang to follow him. The others were mercilessly driven away. The main character inwardly rejoiced that this long-awaited moment had finally come. And now he would definitely help this cursed old man achieve his much-desired immortality. After that, the mad old man solemnly led the main character into his secret room, for he clearly remembered that he was literate, so he wanted the student to carefully look at his legendary book. The master began to chant some ancient spell in a sing-song manner in order to remove the heavy chains that had tightly bound the stone tablet all this time. After that, he respectfully asked the apprentice to carefully examine what was written in the great book of the heavens. He sincerely hoped that he would be able to understand what was inscribed there. Approaching the ancient tablet, the young man clearly understood. All previous knowledge about immortality the old man had obtained from that cursed vase with a human head. If he failed to skillfully combine this knowledge into a whole, the mad old man would immediately reveal his dangerous secret. Therefore, the healer decided to gradually rewrite all the knowledge that was inscribed on the sacred manuscript. Finally, after thoughtfully turning around the massive stone slab, he made a convincing appearance, as if he understood everything, and the master impatiently demanded that the apprentice immediately tell what he had read there. However, the young man noted with surprise that the writing did not contain the recipe for the elixir that the mentor had taught him earlier. The book contained many ancient techniques of internal alchemy. It was written that they could be performed before the new year, simultaneously taking certain external elixirs. Only in this way could one absorb the spiritual energy that passes into the mortal world from the heavens themselves, consume it, and achieve the coveted immortality. There was also a whole list of various types of external elixirs described there, and the main character could read the recipe for one of them. It was necessary to put 120 grams of cinnabar, 100 grams of silver, 60 grams of arsenic, as well as the processed soul of the owner, Yu. However, the guy did not understand at all what this mysterious ingredient was. Master Yu. So he decided to find out about it from the master himself. And he only got angry, realizing what that lying girl in the vase meant when she claimed that the Book of Heavens is changeable and therefore impossible to study. Now the old man began to realize why he had failed to achieve immortality for so long. He was very angry at the girl in the vase, not understanding why this brazen creature dared to deceive him. She deserved a painful death. And of course, the teacher hoped that although that girl managed to fool him, at least Li Huowan would not treat him that way. However, the young man reminded the teacher that the matter concerned achieving immortality. He would not lie about something he himself desperately wished to attain. And carefully examining the main character from all sides with his piercing gaze, the old man ultimately believed his skillful lie. After that, he asked the student to first describe these internal techniques to him in detail. He wanted them to master these sacred techniques together before creating the elixir, like a teacher and a student. The master firmly believed that this time he would definitely achieve immortality, and the main character was only happy to indulge him in this mad pursuit. Soon the young man was returning home with a candle in his hands along the long stone stairs deep into the warehouse. He was immensely glad that he did not have to talk much. Otherwise, the old man would definitely have suspected something was wrong. However, when he arrived, he saw Bai Lin Miao together with the other ingredient slaves who were patiently waiting for his return. Li Huowan asked people not to worry in vain. After all, he returned alive and unharmed, and that means his solemn promise was still in effect. He promised that very soon these unfortunate people would be able to return home to their families. And of course, everyone immediately fell to their knees before their savior. Li Huowan, however, did not understand what they were doing. If it were not for their invaluable help in the main hall, he would definitely have met his end. After all, it was he who should have bowed low before them. In fact, looking back, the healer would never have thought that in this strange, cruel world, he would befriend a whole bunch of such eccentrics. Now he wanted to ask these people for one important favor. It was directly related to the success of their daring escape from the temple. And obviously, Bai Lin Miao immediately realized after these serious words that something was wrong with her older brother. However, he only wanted to find out if there were any other rumors similar to the story about the mysterious Master Yu. Bai Lin Miao immediately told the story about the great-grandmother, an entity who was also called the grandfather. At first glance, she did not stand out particularly. However, Bai Lin Miao, more than anyone else, knew her presence should be spoken of as quietly as possible so she would not accidentally hear. Because, despite her deceptive appearance, the great-grandmother was an unusual entity. Firstly, everyone saw her differently. Some said she was a monster with long, bony arms. Others saw her as a dead old woman. But they say that if you often repeat her name, the great-grandmother may come out searching for the person. If she finds the person, that one will become one with her forever. The main character had such a wild imagination that when he pictured it in all the gruesome details, he was truly horrified. Fortunately, nothing actually happened in reality. Bai Lin Miao, only with a warm smile, decided to ask her older brother if he liked this story. In fact, the guy worried for a long time because he did not know if he would become one with this old woman if he stayed near her for a long time, since this was an extremely strange world where absolutely anything was possible. He thanked Bai Lin Miao for such a useful story and decided to ask the others, "Who else knows anything?" Immediately everyone shouted in unison, for someone did know something after all. Guva also spoke. He knew the story about people who take your skin off, stretch dog hide over it to train you like dogs, and then use you as circus dogs that understand human speech. Those dogs walk the streets and collect money from passers-by. However, Li Huowan did not need urban legends. He needed something truly unusual, like the story of Master Yu, and one of the temple's ingredients named Jiao knew the story about the mother-in-law fish. The elder of his family told about it. The mother-in-law fish is a huge, terrifying fish that appears only during a massive flood. And it really sounded like something strange and mystical, so the main character took it into account. After that, the real thug stepped forward, distinguished by his impressive musculature among all the others. He wanted to tell his story. However, the young man calmly patted him on the broad chest and explained that there had been enough stories for today. It was time for him to return to the teacher, so he asked them to patiently wait for the news the next day. He returned to his mentor and began reading a new recipe, which required taking 2 hearts of the great-grandmother and processing them into an essence. And when the young man tried to ask the teacher who this mysterious great-grandmother was, the teacher only shouted fiercely, ordering the student not to think about anything unnecessary and to continue reading. In the end, Li Huowan continued. The recipe also required taking the gills of the mother-in-law fish, which needed to be soaked in 50 grams of arsenic. Thinking about this, the teacher realized that arsenic itself is cold, so it needed to be neutralized with dry and hot fish. Moreover, the recipes of the heavenly book even used the great-grandmother. Surely now everything would go according to his plan. After all, if elixirs could be made from people, then from monsters as well. While the old man was indignant that he hadn't thought of this earlier, he created a small golden bell in his bony hands using a spell. After that, he rang this bell loudly. However, as soon as the ringing spread around the area, the young man was as if stunned. So much so that he even feared his lie had been exposed. At that moment, the ancient inscriptions on the monument began to gradually smolder. The space around the main character began to change, shimmering with various ominous colors. At that moment, two ghostly silhouettes appeared near the old man. It was the Master Yu. Li Huowan could not even believe that he would summon them using an ordinary bell. Moreover, at that moment, the master took dirt from the ground and began to eat it. After that, he started speaking with Master Yu in some inhuman, eerie language. He also explained to Li Huowan that obtaining the items listed in the elixir was quite difficult. However, for the teacher, it was not a problem. After all, if he knew where to get the necessary items, he could simply take them by force. Of course, Xuanyan also suspected that the old man intended to take them by force with the help of these two summoned ghosts, and the master calmly explained that he needed to take these items by force. After all, they were quite valuable. No one would give them away for free. The creature he summoned with the bell was called Master Yu. It had many different uses. One of them was searching for necessary items, and the old man put considerable effort into obtaining this magical bell. When the crazy old man was only 5 years old, one of the beggars, who was many times older than him, took a stale bun from him. At that time, the boy had no idea that in this cruel world, survival was possible only by one way, and that way was to take. As a young man, he took women, horses, silver, weapons, and even disciples. Once he took an entire temple for himself, where he was now located. He reminded the boy what was written on the ancestor statue in the main hall, and instructively reminded the student that he needed to listen more to what adults say. He shared these stories with his student because he saw in him an unprecedented potential to become better. However, Li Huowan was worried about one thing. After all, he believed that there was something in the world that could not be taken away. However, the crazy old man got angry at the incurably stupid student. After that, he hit him on the head and was amazed that there was so little brain in his head, which was capable of reading. Everything could be taken away. If he couldn't manage alone, he had to take someone else with him. And if that didn't work, he had to act secretly and cunningly. He explained to the young man that it was better for him to listen more to the old man, who perfectly understood how this world was arranged. People told the madman that he couldn't even read, so he understood nothing. They said his path was cruel, that he could not follow the path of Taoism, but when he achieves immortality, everyone will know about it, and then they will no longer be able to say that he lacks knowledge and humanity. For some time after that, Li Huowan lived with the bald old man. All this time he spent on carefully refining the sacred scripture so that the method of achieving immortality became many times more plausible. The crazy old man also did not sit idle. Very soon he obtained all the ingredients that Li Huowan had asked him for. Obviously, he suggested starting the preparation right now. After all, he thought that the bald old man was already eager to begin the preparation. However, he reacted completely unexpectedly. He suggested postponing this important matter and celebrating New Year's Eve. After all, there was still plenty of time before the New Year. Li Huowan was sincerely surprised. Where were they going to celebrate New Year's Eve? But soon the old man placed steaming dumplings on the table. After that, he sent the students to also lay out portions for the deceased students so that their souls would return in the new year. Li Huowan never expected that they would have to celebrate the new year with this crazy old man, and in this cursed place. After that, when everyone was gathered, the master began to eat, expressing delight at how delicious the dumplings with green onions were. Afterwards, he asked his students to start eating, amazed at how they had frozen in place. They looked at the dumplings distrustfully, as if not understanding what they were at all. But the old man understood. The kids lived in good times, because when the madman was their age, he had no idea what dumplings were. It turns out that once during a New Year celebration, he smelled an unfamiliar, appetizing scent. Hungry and freezing, he saw a wealthy family. A girl from that family begged her parents to let him inside and give him food. It was then, when he entered the warm house, that he saw dumplings for the first time. Back then, the dumplings he ate were just like these, also with onions. When Li Huowan tried them, they really turned out to be incredibly tasty. He remembered how on New Year they ate not only dumplings, but also gathered all together. Honestly, he still couldn't believe that all these warm memories were not real. Noticing that the young man had started crying, the old man approached, patted him on the shoulder, and asked him to eat more slowly so he wouldn't choke because of the tears. And only then did the main character realize that he had truly been crying, which he had not even noticed himself. After which the healer, wiping away tears, returned to his food. However, the old man asked that he not force himself to eat if he did not want to. After that, the master generously gave his students red envelopes with money, which they were supposed to put under their pillows. Obviously, they immediately bowed gratefully, thanking the teacher for the generous gift. And he, smiling and as if not understanding why they were thanking him, warmly congratulated them on the new year. After that, he laid out the envelopes for his deceased students, and the only one to whom he did not offer money was his closest disciple, Xuanyang. Instead of money, he offered him to achieve immortality together, as teacher and student. Then they will live together both in heaven and on earth, and the student accepted such a generous offer from the teacher with a forced smile. In the end, this time, the making of the elixir went smoothly. However, the bald old man was naturally extremely suspicious. He decided to share immortality with Xuanyan, only to make sure that he was not lying. However, he was not afraid of anything. In the end, after the recipe was finished, the old man suggested to his student to take the elixir first. In case something went wrong, he would be able to save him. The young man hastily swallowed the pill. However, he understood. Even if something went wrong, he would pretend so that the old man would follow him and die. However, unexpectedly, the main character really felt some incredible surge of energy in his body. He immediately laughed. It seems he finally realized everything and understood how to become immortal. Right after these words, all the master's suspicions seemed to vanish. He wanted immortality so desperately that he immediately swallowed the pill whole. As soon as the master swallowed the potion, the young man could no longer hold back. His stomach hurt intensely, so much that blood immediately gushed from his mouth. Right after this, losing consciousness, he fell to the cold ground. After that, gathering his last strength, he looked at the master to see how he was feeling. He immediately told the man that he had used recipes from folk tales and legends. This means that the old man was not destined to achieve immortality. Now all he could do was become a ghost who would wander the earth forever. After these words, Li Huowan immediately swallowed the bloody pill to nourish his body with forces that would prevent death. Right after that, he approached the old man and, swinging, delivered a powerful blow. A couple of teeth flew out of the man's mouth because of this. He went mad, realizing that Xuanyang had also cruelly deceived him. However, he threw the young man away, ordering that such a lousy guy should not interfere with his attainment of immortality. He wanted to become a great deity and hoped that skill would come to him. Watching how he endured all this unbearable pain and torment, the protagonist was convinced that the old man had completely lost his mind with his insane obsession with immortality. The healer's body really hurt a lot. He regretted not bringing a knife with him to slit the man's throat. However, suddenly the scene before him began to rapidly change into something more resembling a hospital ward. He also saw the ghostly silhouette of Nyayana's face before him. Therefore, he even laughed, thinking that she had come to take him away from this cruel world. Although she was only an illusion, the girl was truly beautiful. At that moment, the voices mixed. The doctor and Nyayana reported in unison that patient 14 had lost consciousness due to food poisoning. Therefore, they ordered an electric pump to urgently cleanse his stomach. Of course, Li Huowan did not understand how an electric pump could even be mentioned in a psychiatric hospital. Moreover, he did not understand why his hallucinations were so plausible and realistic. In the end, he found himself somewhere in the backyards of his clouded consciousness. He heard someone calling him and begging him to hold on a little longer. Immediately after that, the young man began to vomit all the contents of his stomach. He was still alive, and even after what he had eaten. However, what scared him the most was that the old man also survived after swallowing everything. But when he looked back, he didn't even understand what the mad old man had turned into. He looked like a creepy monster with 3 disgusting flowers on top. The old man himself, no longer resembling a human, immediately burst into insane laughter. He began to understand and realize everything, and after he laughed loudly for the last time, his entire body exploded into tiny pieces, turning into bloody mints. The blood from the explosion of his body splattered all over the main character's body, soaking his clothes completely. And when he looked down, he saw pieces of the old man's facial skin on the floor near him. The young man could only hysterically laugh, realizing that the old man was indeed dead. The only mystery for him remained why he himself was still alive. After all, he had no idea what to do next. Soon other students burst into the room, wanting to know what Li Huowan had done to his teacher. They had heard a loud explosion. However, the young man calmly pointed to the bloody clots on the ground, indicating that the students had just stepped on their teacher. Obviously, both older brothers panicked greatly. After all, their great teacher could not have turned into such a mess. However, Li Huowan stretched the skin from his face as indisputable proof of the master's death. After that, he explained that the old man had eaten countless innocent people throughout his life and deserved his death. However, the main character did not kill him for this reason. They had personal scores to settle. Obviously, immediately after this, 2 disciples turned around and ran away from this cursed temple. But Li Huowan asked them to stay and talk with him a little longer. Since they fled without looking back, he took with him a bell and scraps of the old man's face. After that, he came to the captured slaves to deliver the joyful news. Now they could safely return home. Examining the human skin, they immediately recognized the torn face of that cursed old man. Right after that, everyone rushed headlong to escape from the cave, rejoicing that they could return home. They rejoiced that this new year they would finally spend in their native homes. While everyone was leaving, they decided that they must meet again next New Year and rejoiced that the torment was over. However, unexpectedly on the way, they heard very strange, suspicious sounds. Turning the corner, they saw 3 disciples fiercely fighting each other. 2 used swords, and the other, spells. When the mentor saw Zhuan Yan's younger brother, he immediately suggested that he finish off the remaining supporters of the teacher and take the Book of Heaven for himself. The others called on the main character to join them. After all, the master taught him alchemy, and he would not be left alone regardless of who won this battle. Understanding that this argument was completely useless, the young man decided to tell his older brothers that the book did not contain a recipe for immortality at all. It was simply an ancient philosophical writing so they could leave with them and forever forget all those nightmares. However, as soon as the brothers heard that he considered the book useless, they immediately told him to leave and not interfere. The main character also said goodbye to the brothers, allowing them to continue their senseless slaughter. After that, he called all those who wanted to return home to follow him. After all, why interfere in other people's affairs? The blades of these 2 possessed ones were not even recognized by friends. Soon, the entire group finally emerged from all the unfortunate caves, finding themselves at long-awaited freedom. When they came out, the main character saw that the sun had already risen. It turns out he and the old man had lain in that alchemy room the whole night before coming to their senses. Bai Lin Miao immediately approached the young man, suggesting to the little brother to return home together. However, carefully taking the girl by the hand, the healer asked her to stay for a moment. He wrote down the last words and names of those people whom the teacher used as medicines and asked to pass this on to the guards in the nearest town so that they could spread this news to their relatives. Of course, Bai Lin Miao immediately felt that the elder brother's words sounded as if he did not want to return home. However, the reason was that the young man simply did not have a home. Therefore, upon gaining freedom, he turned to the only place he knew. Already lying on the familiar bed of hay, the main character realized that today was the first day of the new year, and he had not accepted those disgusting tentacles. So he was curious to find out, would the effect that allowed him to suppress hallucinations disappear? Even if it was all a lie, he wanted to see Nia Yana at least one more time. In the end, the young man sank somewhere into the depths of his foggy mind, as if ready to die at any moment. And into these depths, the only Bai Lin Miao bravely dived after him, begging her older brother to wake up and go with her. However, he refused. After all, it was not so bad for him here either. Hearing these words, Gao immediately suggested returning home without him right away. After all, if he did not want to, there was no point in forcing him. However, Bai Lin Miao angrily scolded Gao, ordering him to be silent. After that, she warmly explained to the young man that since he had nowhere to go, he could go with her. There was plenty of free space in her house, and the eastern region was very spacious. She reminded her older brother that he was not alone. He still had close people who cared about him. At that very moment, in another modern world, everyone stood over his bed in the intensive care unit, begging the fighter not to leave them. He was not allowed to die, and the voice coming from that side was painfully familiar to Li Huowan. So he immediately recognized Nia Yana. After that, the young man rushed forward to her, embracing the girl tightly. But she only asked so that Li Huowan would promise that no matter what happened, he would definitely not give up and would recover. And of course, the main character smiled and promised to do everything in his power. He did not even know that at that moment he embraced Bai Lin Miao. And the girl gently asked her older brother to go with her. After all, she felt very uncomfortable in these gloomy caves. After that, she returned the bundle to the young man, which he had given her. After all, he was the only one among them who could read, so he would have to deliver the last words of the deceased. It turned out that among them there was also a thug who could count. However, one of the unfortunate quickly covered his mouth, realizing that now was not the best time to reveal all his talents. Bai Lin Miao reminded the older brother that he had promised to deliver their last words to those people, and a real man must keep his word. In the end, the healer agreed, immediately hid the paper in his clothes, and agreed to go with them. However, before that, he asked the prisoners to search the temple and take all the food they could find. After all, there was no better solution than to remain without provisions in the middle of the journey. And the main character still had one unfinished business. He wandered through the caves for a long time in search of that black taisu. He searched the entire temple, but it felt like it had grown legs and run away. However, without that potion, the young man would not be able to calm his hallucinations. So he returned to the alchemy room where the corpse of the bald old man remained. However, it turned out that these tentacles had reached all the way here from the cave, apparently to feast on the old man's remains. However, for some reason, the healer noticed that this creature began to rapidly shrink in size, as if melting. It seems the reason was that his life force was somehow connected to the life of the bald old man. Obviously, the main character immediately rushed to the monster, explaining that he needed to gather his strength. After all, if it disappeared, the young man would be unable to do anything about his hysteria. If the monster wanted to eat the old man's body, the healer was ready to personally feed it with that body. However, after Li Huowan fed it the old man's remains, the monster began to bleed even more and shrink in size. But the young man understood. Even if the black Tai Sui died, it could not be left here just like that. By this time, Bai Lin Miao had gathered dried food, money for the road, and a couple of spare clothes. All the useful things that were in the temple. That should have been enough for a long journey. After that, she went to her older brother to find out how he was doing. However, when they reached the cave, they saw that many people had gathered there. Guwa, the weakest in the stomach, was already vomiting, realizing that they definitely should not have looked for Li Huowan. Considering how much he ate, they had a terrible feeling as if he wanted to eat them on the way to the city. Obviously, seeing that the young man was eating the monster, Bai Lin Miao immediately approached him. However, she showed neither disgust nor fear, only greeted him with a warm smile. The main character hurried to explain that these tentacles suppressed his hysterical fits. He did not know the reasons, but the monster continued to shrink as if it was going to disappear, so he had no other choice. However, the girl paid no attention to his explanations. She noticed that her brother's clothes were dirty, and she brought him new, clean ones. After that, she smiled and decided to ask if she could help him in any other way. Li Huowan only gave a forced smile, gratefully accepting her help. After that, he suggested visiting one more place. They reached the old man's house. However, it was very quiet there. It seems the three elder brothers had resolved their conflict. In the end, the healer decided to go in to find out how they were doing. However, the fight ended with all three perishing. In the end, the weapon was no longer needed, so Li Huowan decided to pick up a sword from one of them. The main character knew perfectly well, if he left this heavenly book here, it could be found, and it was unknown how many people would suffer in that case. He decided to cut it with the sword he took. However, it broke into the tiniest pieces. It seems this book was indeed incredibly hard, which is not surprising considering it was a stone. However, since this book was still a treasure, Li Huowan decided to take it with him. Even if he could not handle it, he could always sell it at some market. After that, he approached the second elder brother Chan, taking his sword instead of the broken one. Praying for his soul, the young man suggested to those waiting behind the door to set off on their journey to leave this god-forsaken place. Before leaving, they set everything on fire, allowing the temple to burn down completely. Finally emerging from the cave, the healer wondered what events awaited him at the meeting ahead. Suddenly, he really developed some interest in life. However, suddenly, Bai Lin Miao asked the elder brother to wait a little. After all, her eyes were very sore and teary. And basically, Li Huowan saw nothing surprising in this, considering she was an albino. Therefore, he immediately took the cloth he carried with him and cut it into a thin strip. He carefully tied it over the girl's eyes, asking her to wear this bandage when it was sunny outside. And when the girl complained that she could not see anything in front of her, the young man took her by the hand, promising to lead her carefully. At that time, a family was traveling through the forest, waiting for their son who had gone to the bushes to relieve himself. However, unfortunately, the more the father hurried him to go to the toilet, the harder the task became. However, unexpectedly, the boy heard some suspicious creaking of the trees around him. Looking around and seeing no one, the boy calmed down and thought it was just the wind. However, suddenly, someone appeared right behind him, laughing ominously. When the boy understood what was happening, he immediately ran scared to his parents, even forgetting to put on his pants. He did not know what to do. Everyone asked the head of the family to come up with what to do. However, he did not know either, because in such a situation all that was left was to pray. Therefore, the old man immediately fell to his knees before the great ghost and began to beg it to spare his family. Each of them had a difficult fate, and they were just trying to survive. However, the monster that suddenly appeared right in front of his face decided to find out. Does he look like a human or still like a god? And the old man was frightened that this thing had come to them only to ask this strange question. Obviously, one could not answer at random, because if he was wrong with the answer, his whole family might disappear. First of all, the man admitted that the creature looked like a god. However, when a heartbreaking silence fell, he immediately changed his mind out of fear, thinking that the ghost still looked like a real human. However, it again did not answer anything, so the old man was afraid that maybe there simply was no correct answer here. At that very moment, a group of the main character was making their way through the forest. Guva immediately realized that they were definitely following someone's trail if they were following a trail of excrement. After all, it was still fresh, which meant the person who had done their business was not far away. However, suddenly the healer, becoming alert, ordered the company to stop. Behind him, Guva saw devilry at full height, and in front of them stood a scarecrow. It had two faces, both in front and behind. There was not even a back of the head. At that very moment, the youngest son of the family trembled in hysteria even more when, turning around, he saw the silhouettes of many people behind them. He took them for monsters who had come to kill them! Guva, of course, got angry. After all, they looked nothing like monsters, and the boy could be beaten for such an accusation. However, Li Huowan ordered everyone to calm down and wait until he returned. The monster at that moment decided to find out why the people had come to them. However, ignoring the question, the main character decided to find out what this creature was. It only laughed maliciously, introducing itself as a human, and did not understand the reason for the young man's foolish question. However, he prepared his blade, understanding that this creature was clearly hostile. If he wanted to win, it was better to strike first. Therefore, immediately spinning around, he threw his sword, aiming at the monster's face. However, unfortunately, physical weapon attacks did not work on it, so the sword simply flew back, bouncing off its dense body. The healer had no choice left, so he immediately took the master's bell, which he had been carrying with him all this time. He rang it loudly, and the monster's body immediately began to writhe in convulsions. The young man was glad that this bell turned out to be useful after all. In the end, the monster desperately began to scream in some incomprehensible language until it completely dissolved and disappeared. Very soon, people made a fire and started preparing dinner, and the old man kept thanking the main hero for saving them. Unfortunately, their family had nothing valuable to thank the savior. But he asked the young man to take his pipe as a token of gratitude. It could help him relax. However, since Li Huowan did not smoke, he refused this gift and decided to ask the old man what kind of monster it was. And the old man was, frankly speaking, amazed that the young Taoist did not know this monster. After all, he had expelled the creature that asked to be called a human. Realizing that he would not get any answers from the old man, the healer asked him to at least give him a map. After all, he and his friends were not locals and had gotten a little lost in this forest. However, the old man did not have a map either. He and his family often traveled around this district, thanks to which the man knew every road well. But he was curious to find out where the young Taoist was heading. If they were going the same way, they could go together. For the old man, this was also advantageous, since the youth looked quite strong. If a ghost suddenly attached itself to them, with Li Huowan, they had a chance to survive. The main character explained that he needed to visit many places. He helped his brothers and sisters get out of the temple, and now he had to take them home. But there were still many who would never be able to return to their homes. He had to personally tell their families about the bitter loss. The traveler hastily pulled a bamboo tube from his belt and began drawing on the packed earth, sketching a rough map of the nearby lands. At the very top was the kingdom of Hoshu, slightly below spread Siqi, and to the left of it, their native kingdom, Nanping. Right now, the travelers were heading to Wuliang, and only by passing through these lands could they reach Kangye. To the main character's considerable surprise, the structure of this world vividly resembled the legendary era of the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms of past times. All the states existed separately, like shards of a broken mirror, and there was not a single central government to be seen. Pondering this, the youth decided to ask the old man which path he should choose if he wished to reach the kingdom of Liang. To be honest, such a request greatly puzzled the venerable man. The reason was that this place was incredibly far from here. Moreover, just a couple of years ago, a brutal war raged between them. Noticing this, Bai Lin Miao visibly became melancholic, and a sad shadow fell on her youthful face. However, Li Huowan immediately handed the girl a deliciously grilled shashlik, asking her not to torment her soul with worries. He reminded her of the promise made once, to definitely deliver her to her native lands no matter what happened. Meanwhile, the elder patiently explained that to reach Liang, they first had to overcome the path through Zhanye. It turned out that part of the road they had to travel together, as it lay in the same direction. At that very moment, one of the freed prisoners of the mad alchemist respectfully addressed the elder brother, saying that his family was currently residing in Sanya, and there was the famous news service which, for silver, could deliver a message to any corner of Nanping. Realizing this, the main character understood. Zhanya was something like the administrative center of the entire region. He agreed to follow the respected elder and hoped that he would show them the right way. The man, struck by the politeness of the young Taoist, solemnly promised to definitely guide him and the whole company through these lands. Already on the way, the travelers started talking, and the healer learned that this family had its own traveling troupe. He immediately hurried to ask how the performances were going in these parts. However, things were tough. A terrible drought was followed by a real flood, leaving the common people completely without means of subsistence. When the poor had no money even for food, what kind of tips could there be for performances? The main character assumed that the troupe could earn money from the rich, village aristocrats or wealthy landowners. However, it turned out that they did not hire actors even for funeral ceremonies. At best, they would simply treat them to a hearty meal. That was the entire reward for their efforts. Suddenly, a big man from the troupe noticed children by the road and immediately broke into a wide smile, wanting to greet them. However, his smile turned out to be so frightening that the children immediately burst into tears, taking the good-natured giant for a real monster. Right after that, they ran away, leaving the man in complete bewilderment. At the same time, the elder sadly realized their family troupe was very far from the skill of the young Taoist. He was incredibly strong despite his young age. Surely a bright future full of glory and recognition awaited him. Li Huowan smiled gratefully, then decided to ask the elder, "Were there any famous sects with special abilities in Nanpin?" The main character needed to find a place that would accept someone like him. The venerable man thoughtfully scratched his gray beard. He recalled that in Jinzan there was a sect that helped childless couples conceive through prayers. However, he could not remember its exact name. Therefore, he advised the young man to go to Zinzin and ask some locals. They would definitely know. At that moment, the son of the family head respectfully addressed his father, pointing forward with a hand trembling from excitement. They had finally reached the city of Wuliang. The elder, with a joyful smile, suggested to the young Taoist to go to the entrance of the village and put on a performance there. After all, their family troupe had not started their show for a long time, and it was time to remind the world of their art. Soon the young Taoist was blissfully sprawled on a fragrant haystack, indulging in rest and reflections about the city of Xinjing and the sects hidden there. After all, the sect praying for children did not sound very encouraging in his case. But since they had settled in a large city, they were unlikely to be villains or charlatans. However, Bai Lin Miao, who approached unexpectedly, playfully tickled the youth's face with an ear of grain. He got up, yawning widely, and immediately scolded his little sister, saying that darkness had not yet fallen on the earth, so why remove the protective bandage? It turned out the girl had brought the main character a bronze mirror that actors used for applying makeup. In it, one could clearly see their reflection. However, as soon as the healer saw his own face, he immediately rushed forward to grab the mirror with both hands. Staring at the reflection in surprise, he could not believe his own eyes, and he decided to find out if he really looked the same as when they were in the Qingfei temple. Bai Lin Miao began to calm her brother, saying that he had always looked exactly like that. However, she secretly worried whether he had noticed any inconsistencies in the reflection. The problem was that in this world the youth looked completely different. In the hospital, he was an ordinary schoolboy, but here he seemed significantly older. To be honest, Li Huowan could not even properly remember what he did in this life before ending up in the cursed temple. All his memories were too vague, as if seen through a veil of fog. His life seemed like a cruel joke of fate. At that moment, the performance began on the improvised stage. The grandfather, clad in worn warrior armor, proudly stepped onto the platform with a spear in hand. The actress, holding a baby to her chest, began to tell a sad story. A cruel uncle had driven her out of her native home. Now she was like a roadside weed, mercilessly trampled by passers-by. The days dragged unbearably, and all they could do with the tiny child was beg passers-by for mercy. The audience gasped with admiration watching this touching production, and Li Huowan finally understood what kind of performances this family staged. They earned their living through truly hard work, pouring their soul into every performance. However, at that moment, the old man, noticing the young Taoist among the crowd, immediately hurried down from the stage. He arrived just in time, for the troupe had encountered some difficulties in their family affairs. The venerable man pleaded earnestly for Li Huowan to give them a little help. The main character reminded them that he could not sing. How could he help them? However, the young Taoist was required to support them in a completely different matter. As it turned out, a wealthy family lived in Wulian, and the clan head Hu sent an invitation through a servant. He wished for the troupe to arrange a ghostly performance at his ancestral estate. Li Huowan raised his eyebrows in astonishment. Could it be that this rich man had completely lost his mind and wanted them to put on a show for real ghosts? However, it turned out to be just the title of a special performance that took place in the Hall of Ancestors, right in front of the plaques with the names of the deceased. The healer was still puzzled. Why did the family need his help? They could have perfectly managed to deliver the message themselves. It turned out that the elder was organizing such a ghostly performance for the first time in his life, which made him quite nervous. Therefore, he decided to invite the young Taoist as a talisman. His presence would surely calm the anxious soul. However, apologizing, Li Huowan made it clear that he would not be able to assist. Usually, he preferred to avoid such events. At the moment, he especially did not want to be distracted from his main goal. Soon, the protagonist was strolling through the quiet streets of the town together with Bai Lin Miao. The girl anxiously told him that they had almost no supplies left. Even with the strictest rationing, the food would last only 3 miserable days. The young man understood. The problem was the lack of money. Therefore, he suggested selling the jade pendant, exchanging it for ringing gold. However, Bai Lin Miao reasonably noted that in this tiny village there were no such wealthy shops. Even if they decided to exchange the precious jade for food, there simply would not be enough supplies here. Li Huowan thoughtfully scratched the back of his head, pondering how best to act. And then, unexpectedly, the persistent elder approached him again. He pleaded for the young Taoist to reconsider his generous offer once more. After all, Master Hu was known as a very magnanimous person. The healer inquired how much they were offering for this performance. It turned out the price was 400 grams of silver, and the elder was ready to give the young man a whole half if he agreed to help. Translating all this into copper coins, it amounted to about 5,000 coins. Honestly, Li Huowan could not even imagine how much grain could be bought with such a fortune. While he was feverishly calculating the number of bags of supplies, the elder generously offered the hero to take even 60% instead of 50%. He begged the young Taoist to have mercy on him and agreed to this price. After all, it is not so easy to earn such money by honest labor. Before giving a final answer, Li Huowan decided to find out if there were skilled blacksmiths in this village. He would help the elder with his task, but first he needed to repair his little bell. Soon the young man was already standing in the stuffy smithy. The blacksmith angrily threw the hammer to the ground. He could not melt this cursed little bell. He had no idea how to fix it. However, the main character very much hoped that the master would still find a solution to his problem. He sighed heavily but agreed to help. However, on one condition, Li Huowan also had to assist him. In the end, they began to straighten the ill-fated little bell together with strong pliers. Both were puffing with all their might, drenched in sweat. Very soon, both were completely exhausted. Honestly, even the elder of the troop was amazed. What kind of strange little bell is this? The blacksmith was incredibly curious to find out what metal this thing was made of, since it turned out to be so hard. The old man drew the young Taoist's attention to the fact that since the last battle the bell had been quite dented, so he could use it even in such a distorted form. Therefore, he suggested to start by going to perform the show in the Hall of Ancestors. After all, Mr. Hu was already waiting for them. Understanding that time was of the essence, the healer decided to straighten the bellflower using his own inner strength. The blacksmith explained to the guy distrustfully that since they couldn't manage it together, he definitely wouldn't be able to handle this task alone. However, unexpectedly, the master felt an incredible amount of energy literally pouring out of the young man's body in waves. Li Huowan straightened the bell with his bare hands to a perfect condition, as if it were made not of metal, but of wax. Watching this miracle, the blacksmith finally believed the old man. This young Taoist was truly something. Master Hu this time invited a real master, one hard to find even in broad daylight. After that, they set off together with the elder. However, before reaching the estate, the main character stopped by a quiet little river. Still, before going to the sacred hall of the ancestors, it was necessary to test the operation of the bell. Outwardly, he looked impeccable, as if he had just come from the hands of a skilled master. The young man decided to try to use it just like the old mad alchemist once did, and rang invitingly. Everything worked exactly as it did back then when the master from the cursed temple did it. Before him materialized the ghostly host, Yu. After that, the healer acted like that leprous old man. He gathered a handful of earth from under his feet. Then he chewed it, swallowed it, and addressed Master Yu before him. Now he finally began to understand the spirit properly. They spoke the same language. The main character decided to inquire from Master Yu. whether he could use his supernatural abilities. However, it turned out, a single use of the spirit's abilities cost a whole 3 months of life. Naturally, for the main character, this was an exorbitantly high price, which he could not afford to pay without extreme necessity. The healer tried to bargain, hoping to reduce such a harsh fee, but Master Yu categorically refused to make concessions. His terms were unshakable. Such a state of affairs was completely unsatisfactory to the hero. Therefore, he authoritatively ordered the ghostly master to disappear from sight, while he gloomily pondered that Master Yu should be used with prudence, only in the most desperate situations. Soon, as previously agreed, he appeared together with the elder in the sacred hall of the ancestors of the noble family. The venerable man patiently awaited the young Taoist at the entrance and was clearly pleased when he finally arrived. With a relieved sigh, he led the guest inside the spacious room, where a thick aroma of incense lingered. Li Huowan decided to find out how the preparations for the unusual performance were progressing. It turned out the elder had just finished a conversation with Mr. Hu. The wealthy master reported that in all the past years when he hired traveling performers to perform before the spirits of the ancestors, nothing special or alarming ever happened. However, suddenly the elder noticed that very master, solemnly walking through the hall. He hurried to introduce him to the young Taoist, about whom he had spoken so enthusiastically earlier. The master promised that as long as this young man was nearby, everything would go smoothly and without the slightest incident. The wealthy gentleman only smiled benevolently in response, politely explaining that he was very much counting on the help of these two worthy people today. However, the host was quite surprised that the venerable master had come only with the young Taoist, since his troupe also included female performers. The elder hurried to reassure the gentleman, asking him not to worry about anything. All the girls were currently busy with preparations outside, by the wagons. They would never break the rules of this house, and would not enter the ancestral hall without an invitation. Mr. Hu calmed down and, squinting slyly, explained the conditions of the upcoming ritual. As soon as the performance begins, all living beings must leave this sacred hall. Therefore, he asked the old man to take care of everything else. As for the performance itself, it would have been better to choose something cheerful and varied. The deceased ancestors supposedly appeared to them in dreams and told them that in the afterlife there reigns a rather dull silence, and they longed to hear something festive and lively to dispel the eternal boredom of non-existence. And also, as soon as the event begins, the living will be strictly forbidden to communicate with the performers so as not to disturb the sacred peace of the ancestors and not to violate the delicate boundary between worlds. The old man immediately bowed respectfully, solemnly promising to strictly observe all these rules. The main character cautiously noted to himself that so far everything was going too smoothly and successfully. Such tranquility aroused vague suspicions, as if a deceptive calm precedes a storm. Soon the venerable musician was already seated at his intricate instrument, skillfully playing melodies in full accordance with the preferences of the deceased ancestors. Elegant sounds spread throughout the hall as if invisible spirits were dancing in the air. Count Hu, for example, loved to savor fine wine during his lifetime while listening to light, cheerful songs. At the same time, Mr. Tse especially admired the art of graceful dancers. Therefore, the troupe performed a play about ordinary people suffering under the oppression of unjust rulers, and about valiant heroes who came to save these oppressed people from cruel tyranny. The story told how from the most ancient times greedy rulers invariably led to countless sufferings of commoners. As the wise proverb says, great success is always paved by the road of thousands of innocently perished, whose bones line the path to glory. All this time, Li Huovan carefully observed the scene unfolding on the stage. Although the performance was lively and colorful, the mysterious audience, the ancestral spirits, remained in deadly silence throughout. The performance unfolding before the main character's eyes was indeed very captivating and masterfully executed. However, despite how beautiful the music was and how skillful the actor's play was, listening to it all night long proved exhausting even for a person with iron endurance. Moreover, the young man was tormented by a strange, anxious feeling, Ever since they crossed the threshold of this hall, he began to feel suspiciously sleepy. His eyelids grew heavy as lead, and his thoughts drifted as if in a thick fog. This was an extremely bad sign. After all, from the moment he accepted generous payment for this job, he was categorically forbidden to fall asleep while performing his duties. However, suddenly the healer snapped out of the confusing delusion, shaking his whole body. He noticed with horror that the music abruptly stopped, hanging in the air with an anxious silence. The young man immediately jumped to his feet and anxiously asked the master what had happened. What was the reason for such an unexpected halt of the performance? At this dreadful moment, he finally saw the actors. All of them pressed against each other, trembling with chilling fear and looking somewhere upwards with eyes glazed from terror. At that moment, a ghostly silhouette emerged from the darkness. He kindly thanked the troupe for the excellent performance and decided to generously give them a worthy reward. Li Huovan, of course, immediately recognized this ghostly entity. He had already met this creature in the forest. In the next moment, from the wide sleeves of this ghost, who insisted on being called a man, jingling coins began to fall. They poured down like a rain of gold, ringing in the deathly silence of the hall. Everyone present became unbearably scared. Their blood froze in their veins from this supernatural spectacle. However, the old man, as he covered his trembling palm over his mouth, did not utter a single sound. After that, the ghost smoothly floated right up to their faces, twisted with horror, cunningly smiling and closely examining each one with his deathly gaze. Then, right at the feet of the stunned performers, he poured out a whole sparkling mountain of shiny gold coins. The wealth scattered across the floor with a melodious chime. After that, the creature withdrew contentedly and leisurely soared back to its observation chair, settling there with the air of a true art connoisseur. Li Huowan coldly and calmly reminded the venerable master that the performance must continue no matter what. Such are the terms of the contract. Of course, the old man was deeply shaken and frightened by these dispassionate words of the young Taoist. However, he calmly sat down next to them on a wooden stool and authoritatively ordered the artists not to stop singing under any circumstances. After all, their dear guest had already rewarded them so generously for their efforts, it would be a sin to disappoint him. There was simply no choice left. The old man, with trembling hands, exchanged a meaningful glance with his son, giving a silent signal, the performance must continue, no matter the cost. While the act unfolded further, the main character feverishly pondered, why had this terrifying entity appeared here? It did not even try to attack them, as if it wanted something specific from mortals. Its behavior was strange and unpredictable. However, suddenly the ghost began to clap its hands contentedly, noticing something on stage that particularly pleased it. He applauded with such genuine enthusiasm that now it truly looked as if the spirits of the ancestors had indeed come from the afterlife to enjoy the skillful performance of mortal artists. However, everywhere swirled some sinister, unnatural fog. It enveloped the entire stage in a thick veil, where the terrified artists desperately danced like puppets in the hands of an invisible puppeteer. Suddenly, the ghostly approached the most frightened member of the troupe, the youngest boy, stretching out its bony, otherworldly paws with long claws toward him. Immediately after that, the creature literally climbed into the boy's head with its ghostly hands and extracted a tiny trembling flame from there. As soon as this glowing clump left his physical body, it immediately materialized, turning into a flickering candle of life energy. And as soon as the candle was greedily bitten off by the monster, the boy was clearly twisted by convulsions. His face distorted into a mask of agony, and his body writhed in convulsions. At that horrifying moment, the emotions of the youth appeared in the ghost's mouth. His fear, his despair, his life force. The monster devoured them along with a part of his immortal soul, savoring every piece. The main hero, arriving just in time for this critical moment, skillfully caught the remainder of the bitten candle that the monster carelessly dropped. Carefully examining it, he understood with grim certainty, since ghosts cannot have such base-eating habits as mere mortals, what he was devouring was clearly no ordinary candle, Most likely, it was pure fear, born in the trembling hearts of frightened people. It was this that the creature fed on, drawing strength from human emotions. It was clear. After this assumption, the ghost became quite angry. Its ghostly aura flared scarlet. So Li Huowan most likely hit the mark with his guess. However, the healer ordered the old man not to stop the performance under any circumstances. It was better for them to close their eyes and just continue the act until the last breath, no matter what. The performers obeyed the wise advice, tightly closed their eyelids, and continued the show almost blindly, relying only on muscle memory and years of training. The ghost, with unhealthy curiosity, rushed straight to the main hero, eager to find out, did he resemble a human or a deity? However, the youth instantly defended himself with his faithful sword, for in his firm opinion, the visitor from the other world looked more like an evil spirit hatched from a cursed egg with two yolks. A grotesque anomaly of nature. The monster, without hesitation, used supernatural healing. Its torn wound closed at an incredible speed, as if it had never existed at all. However, unexpectedly, when the monster forcefully pushed the hero away, his worn bag with the precious book came undone, and the sacred tome almost fell out. The ghost took advantage of this chance and tried to attack the defenseless opponent. However, as soon as he carelessly touched the heavenly book, he was literally scalded by an invisible flame. Howling in pain, he immediately jumped back, staring in shock at his burned limbs. Honestly, Li Huovan did not expect at all that this brazen ghost would be panikedly afraid of the sacred heavenly book. Realizing this unexpected advantage, the young man smirked slyly and stepped back, not even trying to retrieve his sword that had flown aside, for he now had a weapon clearly more serious than ordinary steel. After this discovery, the two opponents fiercely clashed again in a deadly fight, each using the strongest of what they possessed. The main hero longed to send this vile ghost straight to the underworld. Therefore, he forcefully threw the glowing book at him, sincerely hoping that the sacred volume would finally destroy this abomination. However, at the decisive moment, the nimble ghost somehow managed to slip away, instantly moving behind the protective wall. The monster was incredibly lucky to avoid death. At this tense moment, an old man from the troop approached the out-of-breath hero, respectfully bringing the sword that had fallen in the heat of battle. Li Huovan accepted him with sincere gratitude, amazed by the old man's courtesy and bravery in such a dangerous situation. But when the young man looked up next time, the ghost was already towering before him. With his demonic, soul-piercing gaze, he decided to finally find out whether this audacious mortal resembled more a human or a deity who dared to challenge him. Only then did the main hero realize with chilling horror the terrible truth. The good-natured artist was not real at all. It was only a skillful illusion created by a cunning monster. Moreover, because he trustingly accepted the sword from his ghostly hands, the young man now had absolutely no time to retreat to a safe distance. The monster had already grabbed him with its bony limbs, greedily wishing to envelop him in darkness and completely consume his soul, sucking out every last drop of life force. However, he did not manage to carry out his sinister plan, for Li Huowan swiftly grabbed his saving bell and desperately rang it, calling for otherworldly help. Now, the brazen ghost had nowhere to run and nowhere to hide from retribution. In the end, it was mercilessly devoured by Master Yu, who materialized from the bell. The ancient spirit began methodically biting off hefty pieces from the monster until it howled with an inhuman wail, losing its former revealing appearance. Finally, its ephemeral body completely softened and turned into a disgusting slime of unknown origin. It spread across the floor in a vile puddle. The main hero, with belated realization, understood the true body of this treacherous ghost had been hiding in the shadows all along. Obviously, that was why cutting its visible form in half did not particularly help in the fight. After that, the young man wearily glanced at the pale moon outside the window. Judging by its position, it was already about 5 in the morning. The dawn was relentlessly approaching. However, when the healer suddenly turned back, he saw with chilling horror the very same monster before him. It laughing ominously with a guttural laugh, smugly explained that the god of joy eternally sings and smiles, is always well-dressed and invariably polite to everyone. Such is his immortal nature. The young man was seriously frightened. This incomprehensible creature was still alive, and completely unharmed. He desperately rang the bell again, attacking it with the help of faithful Master Yu. However, this also did not help to destroy the monster. Now the cursed ghost rapidly split in two and continued mockingly singing its dreadful songs, as if mocking the powerless attempts of a mortal. After that, the two began actively sharing further, and the ghosts around became more and more. They intertwined into a huge, pulsating heap, surrounding the bewildered hero from all sides with an impenetrable ring. So the young man even refused to believe that everything happening to him was serious and real. It seemed like a mad nightmare in broad daylight. He realized the fatal truth too late. He had fallen into a carefully set trap from which there was no escape. At that nightmarish moment, when the sticky threads of the ghostly creatures tightly bound him, his whole body began to rapidly decompose, literally in terrifying seconds right before his eyes. Flesh fell off in chunks, exposing bones. The main hero desperately tried to interrupt this unthinkable nightmare, using all his strength to not think and not listen to what those vile ghosts whispered to him with their poisonous voices. In the next moment, the hero saw with horror before him that very monstrous face, as if trying to break through the very heavens, tearing the fabric of reality. The young man convulsively realized that he absolutely must not look at this god-abominable spectacle anymore. He urgently needed to close his eyes before it was too late. However, suddenly behind his tense shoulder appeared a greenish, ghostly hand of unknown origin. It began methodically crumpling and mercilessly destroying the distorted space that was right in front of him. As a result, all the terrible visions began to gradually collapse and vanish without a trace, like dissipating smoke, until the healer found himself back in the ancestral hall. He breathed heavily and unevenly, trying to recover his breath. The young man clearly understood. He was miraculously saved thanks to this mysterious green hand. It was precisely it that helped him hold on until the saving dawn, when the unclean lose their power. Already looking at the tired dancers and musicians, one could say with relief that their music had not ceased for a moment throughout this nightmarish night. At that very moment, the wooden plaques with the engraved names of the deceased, which stood behind the main character, ominously began to shake. Turning around, Li Huowan gratefully thought that perhaps it was the spirits of his ancestors who saved him from certain death by intervening at the critical moment. Immediately after his mental question, the plaques simultaneously fell down onto the cold stone floor with a dull thud. The young man understood. Even if these ancient spirits had become his unexpected saviors, they still should not have reacted so violently and obviously to what was happening in the world of the living. But at that tense moment, the very same greenish hand ghostly reached out again to his emaciated shoulder, as if wanting to communicate something. When the long-awaited morning finally came and the first rays of the sun broke into the hall, the inspecting servants arrived. They breathed a sigh of relief, realizing that the deceased ancestors were completely satisfied with the performance of the mortal actors. All the incense in the censers went out simultaneously, which was considered an exceptionally favorable sign, indicating the mercy of the spirits. Therefore, the head sincerely thanked the artists for their hard work and decided to generously treat all participants to a lavish feast as a token of appreciation. However, quite unexpectedly, a boy approached the venerable elder, whose enthusiasm for the troup's nocturnal chants was sincere and boundless. Their melodies spread even beyond the walls of the estate, reaching the ears of the most distant servants. The youth turned out to be none other than the grandson of the head of this noble family. He had come here solely to pay tribute to the art of the traveling performers. Naturally, the head of the wandering troupe was immensely flattered. Their modest chants had pleased such a high-born lord. But in the next moment, the man who had previously been having a polite conversation with the guests sharply changed his tone. He authoritatively ordered the servants to immediately escort the young lord back to his chambers. The boy was to continue his studies. The loyal servants immediately seized the boy, dragging him against his will out of the hall. The poor fellow desperately screamed, begging not to be taken away, for he did not want to study at all. Watching this heart-wrenching scene, the elder noticeably saddened, and sorrow cast a shadow over his wrinkled face. The head of the estate hastily cleared his throat, clearly wishing to hush the awkward topic. After which, through a servant, he handed the agreed sum to the stranger, 400 grams of silver, which gleamed with a cold metallic light. Having fulfilled his duty, the noble lord bowed and left the hall. No sooner had the master left than the grandson rushed headlong to his grandfather, joyfully noting that all those tedious conversations had finally ended. The boy was literally aching with desire to taste stewed pork and fried potatoes. Without delaying a moment, he stretched out his impatient hands to the table, where the dishes specially prepared for their troupe were displayed. However, the head of the family of artists gently but firmly pushed the grandson away from the coveted pork. Instead, he handed the dish to Li Huovan, insisting that the healer taste the treat first. After all, since the Hu family had shown such generosity by preparing such exquisite dishes for them, the protector of their small group certainly had to try them before the others. However, the young doctor politely asked the man not to worry about him. He would have time to satisfy his hunger later. Right now, he was much more troubled by another question. Had the venerable elder seen how all the memorial plaques with the names of the ancestors had fallen to the ground? To the great regret of the main character, the elder noticed nothing of the sort. He sang all night long with his eyes tightly closed, completely immersed in the sacred ritual. The reason for Li Huovan's anxiety lay in the fact that that night, though barely distinguishable, he heard the voice of his mad mentor. It did not matter in which of the worlds of existence. Only that cursed old man called him boy with such contemptuous familiarity. Everything that happened, the fallen wooden plaques with the names of deceased ancestors, the suddenly vanished god of joy, about whom the ghost sang, made no sense at all. Perhaps his teacher really did achieve the coveted immortality and ascended to the very heavens. But believing in such a thing was unbearably difficult. After all, the alchemist derived all cultivation methods and elixir recipes from Li Huowan's own mind. That means the mad old man could not have become a true celestial being. He transformed into something completely different, something dark and unknown. Noticing that the hero was clearly tormented by anxious thoughts, the elder sincerely tried to help him. Now they were like one family, and the young man could freely share his worries. However, to his sorrow, Li Huowan clearly understood. Regardless of what happened that ill-fated night, he still had to move forward. The path lay to Season, where he was to find the gates of Zhengde, as told by the younger Liu. And if his mentor truly gained immortality, then it is precisely there that the young healer will definitely be able to clarify something. Having said this, the doctor hurriedly left, explaining that his appetite had left him. He kindly suggested the family start the meal without him. Of course, the kind-hearted old man immediately rushed after him, wanting to give the hero at least some provisions for the road, and besides that, to give the young man the 240 grams of silver owed for the help. In the end, the food was given to the healer's companions so that they could satisfy their hunger. Bai Lin Miao was burning with curiosity. Where did this food come from and what really happened last night? Li Huovan laid everything out to the girl as if from the heart, not hiding a single detail. However, after this story, the young companion became deeply saddened. She began to apologize for dragging Li Huowan along as if he were a heavy burden. After all, if they did not bother him, the healer would not have to endure such severe trials. But the guy was fully aware. The prisoners from the dungeon were in no way connected to this incident. Since that creepy entity appeared for them all the way in the Hall of Ancestors, it means it had long set its evil eye on them. If nothing had happened yesterday, sooner or later they would have had to face it anyway. After that, the young man remembered how exactly Bai Lin Miao pulled him out of the bottomless abyss of despair when he was ready to lie down and die, surrendering to the darkness. Therefore, he gently placed his palm over her hand, confessing that he did not even know which of them was the real burden. Obviously, Bai Lin Miao was embarrassed by such closeness. So she hastily withdrew her palm, her cheeks flushed with a crimson blush of shyness. However, in the very next moment, she herself caught the young man's hand, intertwining their fingers. After that, she hid her embarrassed face, burying it in the hero's shoulder, as if seeking protection from her own feelings. Thus, they spent the rest of that long night under the cover of stars. At dawn, the travelers continued their journey. The elder hurried to explain to the young Taoist that the village of Wulian was not so far from Jiangye. They would reach it in about 4 to 5 days of unhurried travel. As the hero correctly remembered, Zhao Wu had once lived in that city. Therefore, he did not fail to ask how the young man was feeling. After all, he would soon be home. This should have made him happy and filled his heart with anticipation of the meeting. However, the young man simply saw no point in returning to his homeland. There was no place for a worthless person like him there. He could not even handle simple work properly. He was just a useless parasite whom no one at home welcomed. These words angered Li Huowan to the core. If the young man considered himself so useless, then during their journey the healer could have taught him the art of alchemy. After all, the young man did not necessarily have to do dirty black work. He could learn anything. If he remembered even part of the knowledge, he would return home a real doctor. And he definitely would not starve. However, instead of alchemy, the young man wanted to learn to read. With this timid request, he turned to the hero. And at that very moment, many curious eyes fixed on the young healer. It was obvious. Everyone was eager to learn to read. Li Huowan did not even understand where they got such a sharp and passionate desire to learn literacy. Even the venerable elder was amazed that the young Taoist was literate. He fervently asked the hero to teach him as well, folding his hands in a pleading gesture. In the end, seeing the plaintive looks of the elder and the other companions, Li Huowan allowed everyone who wished to participate in the lessons. Since everyone is so fired up about this aspiration, they could start the lesson right now without delay. However, quite unexpectedly, not even an hour had passed when the elder was already rushing headlong towards the cart. This greatly surprised his son and grandson. Approaching his daughter-in-law, the head of the family asked her to fetch all the remaining dried meat from their meager supplies. Although the woman was puzzled by the strange request, she still brought what was required. There was not that much meat, which, in principle, is not surprising for a traveling troupe. The girl shyly explained that she wanted to save up some money. After all, her father-in-law did not pay them very generously. They earned something from that night performance, but the lion's share went to Senior Sue, even though they were the ones who sang all night long. The husband hurried to stop his wife, fully understanding that the father does not like it when his decisions are challenged. After that, he decided to find out why his father needed the meat. Perhaps it would be used for dinner. However, the elder explained that he intended to bring this as an offering to his new teacher. Obviously, 3 pairs of curious and puzzled eyes immediately fixed on him, and looking at their confused faces, it became clear. No matter how much you explain to them, they still won't understand anything. Therefore, the head of the family ordered his grandson to go with him. When they reached the Master Taoist, everything necessary must be done. The elder also asked the boy not to worry about anything. After all, the Taoist was truly a great man. Everything the grandfather did was solely for the boy's benefit. If the boy followed the Taoist's instructions, he would no longer have to perform on dirty streets begging for pennies from indifferent passers-by. However, the grandson was extremely surprised that the grandfather no longer wanted him to perform for the amusement of the crowd. When the venerable elder approached the resting place, he saw that the hero was already conducting an improvised lesson for those interested. Of course, when Li Huowan noticed the elder who had returned after a recent escape, he decided to inquire about what had happened. The troop leader immediately began to introduce his grandson to the hero in more detail, but did not manage to finish. Completely unexpectedly, the young master, the very boy from the noble estate, rapidly approached them together with a guard. He had come here to sing along with all of them. Naturally, the elder was extremely excited by the appearance of the young master in their modest camp. The boy needed to hurry and return to his home walls, otherwise all the household members would be mortally worried about him. However, the boy categorically did not want to go anywhere. He simply wanted to sing with this troupe of wandering performers because that was what he liked most in the world. But the old man still could not forget the stern face of the head of the family when the young master dared to ask permission to perform with the street singers. Until that moment, the youngest in the family did not even suspect what their craft really meant in the eyes of the nobility. But now he saw clearly and understood everything with bitter clarity. The boy's father arrived to take his unruly child. He reminded his son that he had spent a considerable amount of money to find him a worthy teacher capable of teaching the youth to read and write with proper grace. The head of the estate could understand that today his heir had not made enough effort in his studies. But he could not forgive his son for desiring to become a miserable street performer. The noble lord reminded him that street performers are the lowest rung of society, despised by all respectable people. He raised his son to be part of high society, not for the offspring to try to become a poor beggar. Therefore, the angry father immediately rewarded his son with a sharp slap, ordering him to stop being so disgustingly foolish. In the end, the boy burst into bitter tears, explaining to the head of the estate that he was wrong. He swore that he would no longer act so foolishly. Only at that moment did the old man's grandson realize why neither his father nor grandfather allowed him to associate with the young master from the noble family after the performance. From the very beginning, the whole world saw them as disgusting, unworthy even of a glance, and he himself was among that world. That same night, Li Huowan also did not know what to think. He could not find Bai Lin Miao and the other companions, as if they had dissolved into the twilight. However, quite unexpectedly, the young man noticed ahead a bright, almost unearthly glow. Deciding to check who was there, he ran closer. Approaching the mysterious silhouettes, the healer immediately asked if they had seen his group of many people. But these three glowing figures turned out to be his mother, Nia Yana, and Bai Lin Miao. The girls were delighted to see the hero alive and unharmed. The healer also sighed with relief, glad that at least he had found them. Only later did he realize something was clearly wrong. His mother and Nia Yana simply could not be in the same place with Bai Lin Miao. It was impossible by the very nature of things. Moreover, the young man could not move of his own will at all, and his arms and legs moved by themselves, as if controlled by invisible threads. And then he saw the terrifying silhouette of his late teacher, who thanked the student for bringing all the necessary ingredients for the great ritual. The alchemist's ghost promised that together they would achieve immortality, no matter how monstrous it might be. At that moment, the hero finally woke up from the nightmarish haze. Sitting next to him all this time was the extremely worried Bai Lin Miao, patiently waiting for his awakening. As soon as she saw the hero suddenly jump up with heavy breathing, she understood. The elder brother had clearly had a terrible nightmare. The young man felt immense relief, realizing that it had all been just a bad dream born from his tormented mind. Meanwhile, Bai Lin Miao offered the hero fresh pies to try so he could have a snack after the long, exhausting journey. Of course, the young man became worried. How did the girl acquire these treats, considering they practically had no money? However, she only shyly explained that she decided to sell her gold bracelet. Of course, it was more than strange. After all, Li Huowan clearly remembered that he gave this bracelet to his childhood friend, Nia Yan. Only later did he recall with painful clarity, there was no Nia Yan in this world. It turned out he returned the jewel to Bai Lin Miao on the very same day. At that moment, the girl admitted that her older brother worked very hard for all of them, and she did nothing for the common good. Therefore, selling the bracelet was all she could do to help him in return for his care. The young man was deeply touched by this selfless gesture and gratefully accepted the buns that the girl had bought especially for him. However, he solemnly promised, when fate finally turns to them and the situation improves, he will definitely buy her a gold bracelet better than the previous one. Elegant, worthy of her kind heart. Bai Lin Miao only shyly bowed her head, desperately trying to hide the shame that overwhelmed her. But she still promised to patiently wait for that bright moment, keeping his words in her heart. Soon the travelers reached the desired city, whose majestic walls loomed on the horizon like a promise of safety. Deciding to stay at an inn, they were finally able to rest after long days of wandering. During lunch, when fragrant dishes steamed on the table, Li Huowan decided to ask the venerable elder what exactly that sinister sect was famous for, besides their prayers for newborns, of course. Although the old man had never been in that sect personally, he could confidently assume that it was most likely an ordinary community with some crazy old man at the head. Surely they read some complicated mantras day and night, considering themselves enlightened. Bai Lin Miao was genuinely surprised by her older brother's questions. After all, she thought they would stay here for at least a few days to regain strength. However, the Taoist saw no point in lingering in these parts. After all, he had already conveyed the last dying words of the members of that cursed Zhao Wu sect, who finally returned to their native walls. Next, the young man would find messengers to send all the sad news to the necessary addresses. They simply should not stay here without a good reason. However, quite unexpectedly, the hero's gaze caught sight of some guy raising his hand at the far end of the noisy hall. It was that very Zhao Wu who, it turns out, had not left their company at all. Of course, the Taoist was stunned, completely unable to understand why the young man had returned to them. But the guy who was sitting with him at the same table calmly, as if talking about the weather, explained. The father disowned the son because of his injury. It was more than expected. Moreover, a terrible truth was revealed. Many years ago, Zhao Wu's parents sold him to that sect for a pittance. It was not an abduction at all, as everyone naively believed. Of course, the hero objected that they must have misunderstood something. After all, as ancient wisdom says, even a fierce tiger does not devour its cubs. However, the unfortunate young man only flared up with righteous anger at these words. After all, his own parents sold him for 80 grams of silver, sold like cattle at the market without even thinking about his fate. Most likely, elder brother Li Huovan was simply too noble and naive in his judgments about people. Of course, the prisoner did not argue. Perhaps tigers really do not devour their own offspring. However, some people do not stop even before devouring the flesh of their own flesh if profit is at stake. At this painful moment, Bai Lin Miao approached the sufferer to comfort the young man and ask him not to grieve so inconsolably. Li Huovan decided to directly ask the young man, what does he plan to do next? Does he wish, after all the terrible things that happened, to return to his native home? However, the prisoner wanted to return there solely to make all those involved pay for what they had done. He longed for just retribution, which burned his heart like a flame. At the same time, another young man admitted that he could not return to his native land, so he expressed a desire to embark on a long journey together with the hero, wherever the path might lead. Of course, the Taoist agreed to accept them into his small group. However, he suggested that before continuing the journey, they should properly replenish themselves and gather strength. After that, he summoned the quick-witted innkeeper to finally place an order. The latter hastened to serve the travelers with due diligence. Some time later, the travelers continued their long journey through the boundless lands. When they made camp in a secluded spot under the shade of ancient trees, the hero climbed a sprawling tree to watch the surroundings and look out for danger. The venerable elder approached him, earnestly urging the young man to at least rest his exhausted body a little. He even offered the healer a couple of appetizing steamed buns to snack on, while the troop leader stayed alert in his place. Of course, Li Huovan suspected that the master came to him because something was wrong in the camp. However, it turned out that the boy who traveled with them had gone somewhere into the forest thicket and had not yet returned to the others. So the kind-hearted elder did not know whether to send someone to search for the carefree youth. However, Li Huovan asked the man to quickly take his watch post. The healer himself will find his lost companions. He should not have worried about it in vain. Soon the hero was already running swiftly through the gloomy forest, loudly calling out the name of that runaway fool. However, quite unexpectedly, he noticed a human silhouette between the trunks, and was even surprised that his comrade had wandered so deep into the thicket. Moreover, he moved so swiftly in the darkness. The young man immediately approached the stranger, believing that he was the very same reckless fool. However, it turned out to be the most ordinary Buddhist monk, who politely greeted the traveler and decided to find out what exactly he needed in this remote place. It was hard to put into words how stunned Li Huowan was to meet a real Buddhist hermit in these wild lands. The monk, rising from the ground, introduced himself and explained that he truly practiced Buddhism. However, something in his appearance and manners made the vigilant hero wary. Therefore, preparing for possible danger, the healer decided to question the supposed master about where exactly he practiced spiritual cultivation, and to which great Buddha he offered his prayers. It turned out that the stranger had not properly studied the teachings anywhere yet. He had only overheard that there was a Buddhist temple in the north, where followers were fed for free to their fill. And regarding the great Buddha, he honestly did not even know how many of them existed in the pantheon. In the end, the hero calmed down, realizing that he was not even really a Buddhist. After all, usually servants of the faith are not so confused about the basics of their teaching. Moreover, the healer did not care at all whether this man was lying to him or telling the pure truth. But he still strongly advised the wanderer to eat less of the offerings left for the souls of the dead. However, the man was greatly offended that the hero considered him a liar and a deceiver. After all, he was a Buddhist monk and therefore, by definition, could not lie. Such was his vow. However, obviously, his lie was clear to any knowledgeable person. He senselessly whispered the same word, Amitabha, over and over, not even really knowing which deity he worshipped. A worthless monk he turned out to be. But the man was extremely interested to find out from the hero. What should a true monk be like? All he knew for sure was that Buddhists are not allowed to marry, and he did not. The owner of the local shop said that Buddhists are forbidden to eat meat, so he did not eat it. He saw how other monks reverently whispered Amitabha and diligently repeated after them. At that moment, a big guy jumped out from behind the trees, joyfully announcing to his older brother that he had found wild rice in the forest thicket. However, the hero immediately rewarded him with a sharp blow to the stomach, angrily scolding him for daring to eat the offering left by the deceased, and such behavior was categorically forbidden. It was a sin. After that, the healer drove the careless glutton back to the camp, for it was time for them to return to the others. At that same bitter moment, the poor, self-proclaimed monk could not understand. Why, even though he had done everything the wise people told him, was he still not considered a true Buddhist servant? Soon, the entire motley group finally set off on the dusty road for the further journey. However, since they met more and more people on the highway, Li Huowan made an unmistakable conclusion. They were already not far from a large city, and he was absolutely right. They had about 10 days of unhurried travel left. However, the venerable elder pointed out that such a huge gathering of people was by no means a good sign. Too many travelers on the road were like a herd of fat sheep. And when sheep gather in a crowd, they inevitably attract the attention of greedy robbers and cutthroats. And immediately after these prophetic words, the robbers revealed themselves in all their bloodthirsty glory. They galloped through the frightened crowd on their lean horses, clearly rejoicing that the fat sheep this time had fallen to them as if on a silver platter. The hero instantly called out to his companions, making it clear that the master was right. They really had attracted the attention of bandits. He ordered everyone to run immediately, saving their lives. However, the elder with his family had already rushed ahead on the road, promising on the go that they would wait for the hero at the outpost nearby. They would get there first. The robbers chased after the fugitives to prevent the people from escaping. After all, with their cumbersome carts, travelers will never be faster than swift horses. After that, the cutthroats cold-bloodedly began killing people right on the road, flooding the ground with the scarlet blood of the innocent. After all, they could take money from the victims even when they were lifeless corpses. In this terrible time, behind everyone lagged an ancient old woman carrying a small bundle with her meager belongings. The bandit, approaching her on horseback, only mocked the old woman who was trailing slowly like a turtle, practically asking to be impaled on a sharp blade. However, When the thug tried to attack the defenseless old woman, that very strange Buddhist from the forest shielded her at the cost of his own body. And to be honest, the robber was quite surprised that anyone had the reckless courage to save someone else's life at all. Apparently, this righteousness-obsessed man was clearly not afraid of death. However, the reason for such a brave act lay in the fact that old man Tan, who painted pictures, once said, "For a Buddhist, saving another's life is more important than building an entire temple." And hearing that the monk was not even afraid of death, the robber clearly cheered up, anticipating the amusement. He decided first to finish off the annoying man, and then the old woman whom he saved, and take their heads to himself as a gruesome decoration. However, unexpectedly, the bandit heard the desperate cries of his comrades, who realized that there was something wrong and dangerous with this Taoist, after which they imploringly begged him to leave immediately. At that moment, the hero pounced on those bandits who were closest to him, like a furious demon of vengeance. In the end, the cutthroats realized too late that the young man possessed truly incredible, superhuman strength. They died instantly, as soon as the healer's blade touched their sinful bodies. As soon as the surviving bandits saw that even their formidable leader was killed in a matter of moments, they finally realized how deadly dangerous this demonic guy was. They immediately turned around and decided to run away as fast as they could, cursing the day they met him. Fleeing, they horrifiedly nicknamed Li Huowan the overseer of the heavenly house, the one who delivers divine justice. The hero was overcome only by bitter sadness when he looked around at the bloody devastation. He sorrowfully realized that this world had rotted to its very foundations. Despite the brief invasion of robbers, there were still too many victims, including innocent children who ultimately became complete orphans in this cruel world. And that strange Buddhist immediately began reciting a prayer he knew by heart to grant peace to the tormented souls of these unfortunate people. The escaped bandits warned the other gangs about how deadly the hero was, so the rest of the journey passed completely calmly and safely. Only that beggar, who proudly called himself a Buddhist monk, gave no peace. He stubbornly trudged at the very end of the crowd, feeding exclusively on wild berries and a couple of buns that Li Huowan had mercifully given him. And this went on for 10 long days in a row. Finally, the travelers found themselves at the majestic walls of the city of Jiangye, which soared to the heavens. It was obvious that this exhausting journey had thoroughly worn many out. The venerable elder asked the whole group to go to the city as soon as possible. After all, the inn will be packed to capacity if they delay. However, the hero asked that the old man lead his people to the city on his own. The healer needed to visit the sect that the man had previously spoken of with such reverence. He promised that he would definitely find them in the city later. After that, the healer followed the indicated path to the temple. As is known, most Buddhist monasteries stood high in the mountains, far from worldly bustle. He did not even expect that in the city itself there would really be such a majestic temple. Around the sacred place hovered a thick, intoxicating smell of incense and frankincense. Moreover, it seems Zhuan Yin mentioned this place before her tragic death. Apparently, this shrine was somehow connected to the hero's former mad master, the renegade alchemist. However, although he found the place without difficulty, the healer did not know what to do next. Should he directly declare that he was a disciple of that leprous old man? He thought that if he said this, the Buddhists would immediately decide to punish him as a demonic Taoist who had defiled their threshold. Therefore, the obvious idea was not so good after all. However, quite unexpectedly, one of the monastery monks came out to meet the hero. He politely greeted the guest, immediately bowing respectfully. Li Huowan introduced himself to the master, stating his name. The attendant quickly understood from the young man's look that most likely he had come here not to light incense and offer prayers. After that, he escorted the healer into the temple, warmly allowing him to enter under the sacred vaults. A Buddhist led the hero to a small secluded place and offered the passerby tea. Li Huowan did not expect less from a real Buddhist temple. The monk really looked like a person with a pure, unclouded heart, far from all worldly worries and vanity. However, the hero did not know how to tell the truth about the death of his mentor, that mad old alchemist. In the end, he decided to say everything directly, without hiding the horrifying details. From the shock, The monk even crushed the cup with hot tea that was resting in his hands. The porcelain shattered into small shards, burning his palm with boiling water. From this stormy reaction, one could unmistakably conclude the servant was somehow connected with that cursed temple and the mad master. The Buddhist began feverishly interrogating the hero about the details of the incident and begged him to tell everything in the smallest details, hiding nothing. In the end, Li Huowen told the monk absolutely everything he knew, hiding nothing from the agitated servant. He decided to directly ask, could his lord really have become an immortal celestial being? Or had he turned into something completely different, dark and terrible? After that, the healer assured the doubting monk that he really heard the voice of the deceased teacher that sinister night. It simply could not have been an illusion, because there was also his bell, which confirmed the presence of the ghost. However, to his regret, the monk could not make decisions alone on such an important matter. He needed to report this to their entire sect so that the wise men could gather for a council. So he asked the young man to wait patiently for a while. And although the Buddhist said nothing specific aloud, his worried behavior made it obvious that everything was far from simple. As the healer expected, perhaps it was not yet the end once and for all with his mad master. However, shortly after leaving, the monk returned to the hero with important news. The great master of their monastery wished to meet him personally. Therefore, the servant respectfully led the young man to the very heart of the temple. The great master awaited him ahead in the sacred hall, and the closer Li Huowen approached the sanctuary, the more distinctly he sensed the intoxicating scent of incense, which floated in thick waves through the air. After that, he saw a majestic statue of Buddha, gazing at him with impassive calm. The accompanying monk politely explained that the Buddha of the central world of Vajra was the Tathagata they revered. In total, there were exactly 5 sacred faces of Buddha, after which the sect master calmly greeted the visitor, warmly inviting him to proceed further. The healer, respectfully bowing, introduced himself by his temple name, Xuanyang. After that, he immediately asked the master about what tormented his soul. Had his teacher truly attained the coveted immortality? However, the abbot believed that the main thing now was not who the mad old man really became after death, but what the hero himself believed deep in his heart. Naturally, Li Huowen was slightly annoyed that the master spoke in riddles, like a sage from ancient legends. Therefore, the healer decided to ask directly, could his teacher have become a true celestial being after everything that had happened? However, the master believed that anything was possible in this mysterious world if a person sincerely believed in it. Moreover, he clearly felt that the karma of the deceased mentor at the moment of his violent death was tightly intertwined with the hero's own aura, like 2 snakes entwined around each other. Of course, Li Huowen tensed upon hearing such ominous words. However, he decided not to worry prematurely. Perhaps he misunderstood the sage's words and was giving them too much significance. During further questioning, the young man learned that previously there had been serious disagreements between the Buddhists and the mad alchemist master. After all, the old man robbed and killed local residents, causing chaos and suffering everywhere his foot stepped. Once the abbot even sent his disciples to catch the apostate, but he constantly escaped retribution like a ghost in the fog. Then the hero finally understood. The master considers the madman his sworn enemy and could not leave him alone, even after death. The healer sincerely hoped that the Buddhists would find some way to get rid of the ghost once and for all, so that it would not return from the afterlife. In the end, the majestic man extended his wrinkled hand to the hero, asking him to touch it. However, the young man recoiled in fear, not knowing what to expect from this gesture. Noticing the parishioner's timidity, the Buddhist master gently reminded him, if he believes he can be harmed within the sacred walls, then he should not have crossed the threshold of their temple at all. In the end, the hero realized that resisting would indeed be rude on his part, bordering on insult, so he had to come closer, overcoming his inner trembling. The monk immediately pressed the inner side of his palm to the youth's forehead. Immediately after this, the healer had a terrible impression, as if with this smooth movement his soul was forcibly pushed out beyond the mortal body. The world lost all colors and outlines for a moment. However, only a moment passed, and the Buddhist monk stepped back, finishing his so-called test of truth. Now he finally fully understood the entire situation in all its dark details. However, the abbot warned that he needed to consult with other sages of their monastery before coming to any final decision. He asked the hero to stay within the temple walls overnight, and tomorrow they would definitely come up with a solution regarding his frightening problem. However, unfortunately, Li Huowan could not stay overnight in the temple. After all, outside his loyal friends were still waiting, they would start to worry to death that he had been away for so long. The master did not stop the hero, for it was his own decision whether to stay with them overnight or return to his comrades. However, the sage warned that the temple gates would open only at noon the next day. And Li Huowan himself should not have forgotten, if they do not solve this sinister problem as soon as possible, both the hero himself and all his loved ones will be in mortal danger. Immediately after that, muttering some ancient mantra under his breath, the monk walked away while one of the young novices escorted the hero to the temple exit. But at that anxious moment, a bloody red eye suddenly opened on the bald head of the abbot, pulsating with unclean energy. Of course, the young man felt something suspicious behind his back, as if someone's piercing gaze was fixed on the back of his head. However, when he turned sharply, he did not see an old man in front of him. Therefore, he considered it some small delusion caused by mental fatigue. After returning to the inn, the hero instructed all his companions to question the locals about the mysterious temple. However, he asked them to be especially careful and cautious, for Taoism was involved in this dark matter, making everything even more dangerous. After that, everyone scattered along the bustling city streets in search of the necessary information. Guva was the first to return, having heard that this Buddhist temple was the largest in the entire city, and it housed the best, most fragrant incense in the whole area. A couple more returning scouts heard that even noble people from the palace regularly go to this temple to pray to the all-merciful Buddha. If lucky, one could even see the living Buddha in the flesh. And two others heard that the most devoted monks were in the temple, who strictly observed all prescribed rules without the slightest deviations. Not even once was there a case where any of them broke their vows. Once, one of the novices secretly ate a piece of meat, for which he was immediately expelled from the temple in disgrace. However, Bailin Miao was extremely curious why the elder brother asked them to inquire with the locals about the temple. Could it be that there was something wrong with that shrine, something ominous and dangerous? But unfortunately, the guy could not tell them that the crazy old man might still be alive in some terrifying form. After all, the healer did not want to scare them prematurely. Therefore, after thanking everyone for their diligent work, he asked them to rest well for a couple of days. After all, he himself needed to go back to the temple for an important ceremony. The monk's story seemed quite plausible and respectable. Therefore, the healer decided not to refuse the sect master a second visit. When he returned to the sacred walls of the temple, he was immediately solemnly informed about the ceremony. They were going to conduct a fast of universal salvation to rid Li Huowan of the evil spirit of his late mentor that haunted him. But before they began the sacred ritual, it was necessary to first deal with his restless, troubled mind. Of course, Li Huowan immediately protested fiercely, proving that he was not possessed by a demon at all. However, he only met the calm, patiently waiting gaze of the monks, who looked at him with sympathy. So in the end, the healer had to quickly fall silent, biting his tongue. He decided to ask the master how he could calm his raging, uncontrollable mind. And then the majestic man suggested taking with him the manuscript 5 Aggregates of Emptiness, an ancient sacred scripture. The young man had to read it aloud 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and evening, without skipping. Of course, the hero was sincerely surprised that they did not even give him any special method of spiritual cultivation. He did not need to take any potions, only required to read the sacred text. But with one important condition: The parishioner was better off staying within the temple walls during the reading. You see, if he kept running back and forth, it would only cause anxiety both for the monks themselves and for the hero, and the healer simply had no way out. So he had to agree to these strict conditions reluctantly. He lay down on the hard bed that was kindly provided to him, after which he began monotonously reading the manuscript. However, by the end of the thick book, he was openly getting sleepy. His eyelids grew heavy as lead. At this measured pace, the healer lived for a couple of days, immersed in routine. And he noticed a curious thing. During all the time he read the sacred book, his sleep noticeably improved. Nightmares receded, giving him a respite. However, still, when they finally deal with the old man's ghost, the young man would like to find the black Tai Sui, because if he can stabilize his fractured state, then his life in this harsh world will finally become more normal. But quite unexpectedly, he noticed some ghostly silhouette passing by his room in the dark corridor. When the healer left the cell, he saw the outline of a local monk who was silently walking somewhere away. He seemed to have been watching Li Huowan all this time on purpose, waiting for the moment. Therefore, the hero cautiously followed him through the corridors to understand what the monks were planning under the cover of night. However, he had been following the servant for a very long time, turning through tangled corridors and passages, and he began to realize how suspicious it looked from the outside when you sneak after someone like a thief. But suddenly the monk turned into one of the chambers through a paper door. So the hero carefully stopped near it, holding his breath. Making a small hole in the fragile paper door, he began to peek at what was happening inside. In this sacred hall, worship of Buddha was taking place under the light of flickering candles. At that moment, a young woman was fervently praying to the deity to grant her a long-awaited son. For if she did not bear an heir to her husband, he would mercilessly sell her off like an unwanted thing. Of course, Li Huowan was surprised that the woman came to pray to Buddha so late already deep at night when decent people sleep. However, at this eerie moment, the monk who approached from behind calmly tied a thick blindfold over her eyes. Immediately after that, many monks approached the unfortunate woman and began to strip off her clothes, exposing her body. And she did not even resist, as if hypnotized, standing obediently in place. And finally, the hero realized with horror what the dirty secret of their prayer for the birth of children was. It was a disgusting deception of trusting women. However, obviously, he immediately felt someone's piercing gaze fixed on the back of his head. Therefore, the healer quickly turned around, preparing for danger. He saw the very same monk who had met him near the temple gates on the first day, and now that monk was watching the hero closely, as if assessing his reaction. However, the servant calmly waved his hand, beckoning the healer to come over for a calm conversation. He perfectly understood what the parishioner was thinking now. Perhaps the young man even considered their monks to be unholy sinners and debauchees. However, the Buddhist reminded that the girls themselves came to pray to Buddha very late at night, under the cover of darkness. They desperately desired a son, and the monks could grant them this. Therefore, they did nothing reprehensible or shameful in the eyes of the heavens. However, the hero coldly replied that the master should not waste his strength explaining himself to him. The healer could not dictate to them how to live and what to do. For him, the main thing was only one, that the fast passed calmly, without incidents. Looking at the back of the departing hero, the monk bitterly recalled that before becoming a Buddhist, he was also a Taoist seeking the truth. Therefore, he considered Buddhism and Taoism to be roughly the same teaching, different paths to the same goal. Therefore, the servant asked that the parishioner stop looking down on their religion with contempt. After that, the hero finally left the sinister corridors. Looking back at the majestic temple, he tried to understand. Is there at least one pure corner in this rotten, dirty world, untainted by lies? Returning to his chambers, the healer slept until the next day without dreams. A monk came to him to respectfully report to the parishioner important news. The fast of universal salvation would take place in a couple of days, when the stars occupy the necessary position. Preparation for such a large-scale puja required enormous time and effort. Therefore, he politely asked the hero to refrain from excessive walks around the temple so as not to interfere with the sacred preparations. In the end, thanking the monk for the news, the healer asked the man to convey the following to his master. He sincerely hopes that everything will go successfully and free him from the pursuing ghost. In fact, Li Huovan deeply understood that the master had specifically asked him not to loiter around the temple without purpose. Perhaps the abbot feared that the parishioner might stumble upon other dirty, shameful deeds of their sect carried out under the guise of holiness. However, quite unexpectedly, from around the corner, just as the hero was about to leave the temple, appeared that strange monk beggar whom he had met earlier in the forest. Of course, Li Huovan had not the slightest idea what this ragamuffin had forgotten here, and how he even got into the sacred walls. The Buddhist himself gladly explained that the sect's masters turned out to be kind, merciful people. They took pity on his beggarly existence and allowed him to stay in the temple, work, and do everything necessary for them. Now he had a roof over his head. However, the healer found it extremely suspicious that the old beggar was so easily accepted into the temple. He did not believe in the kindness of these people, not after everything he had seen the previous night. However, the beggar himself sincerely rejoiced in his new fate. After all, now he could eat his fill every single day. And besides, he was finally warm on cold nights. The problem was only that he could no longer do good deeds and help people, which made the poor fellow immensely sad, as if he had lost the meaning of existence. However, the hero asked him not to worry about anything like that. After all, the main thing is that the man was no longer hungry and not freezing under the open sky. With these soothing words, Li Huowan tried to calm his growing anxiety about the fate of this simple-hearted man, but quite unexpectedly, the beggar grabbed the healer by the sleeve to show what he had been working on here. He dragged the hero along the corridors, and he could not understand where the man was rushing to in broad daylight. After all, the sun was shining outside. There was no need to hurry. But what seemed truly surprising and troubling to the young man was that the beggar had somehow become too strong for his frail appearance. At that dreadful moment, the healer felt that reality itself around him began to suspiciously distort and flow, like a mirage in the desert. However, the Buddhist quickly distracted him from this troubling feeling, asking the hero to hurry up. After all, he definitely would not regret it when he saw what was inside. And in the end, ignoring the creepy sensation he had just experienced, the healer followed the excited man. Finally, they came to a wide path that was completely strewn with various statues, skillfully carved from stone. The beggar worked right here. He was moving broken stones to a new place. He also helped sculpt a couple of the standing statues with his own clumsy hands. The hero, of course, was amazed by such an abundance of sculptures. After all, there were an incredible number of statues, like a whole stone army. So the healer assumed that perhaps the temple sold them for a considerable amount of money to wealthy townspeople. However, that was far from all that the monk wanted to show the hero. The beggar led him inside one of the dark temples, and there everything was filled with sticky blood and the foul smell of raw, rotting meat. In the middle of this whole disgusting pile stood a squelching something, seemingly made of human intestines and innards. In fact, this disgusting squelching mass consisted of many bloodied silhouettes of people who completely lacked mouths and eyes. Instead, there were just dark, bottomless black holes in the flesh. Of course, at first the hero thought he was having another hallucination, so he could not understand what the hell was happening to him. Meanwhile, the old man gently lifted Li Huowan's head up so that he could look at the large, majestic statue of Buddha towering above them. However, the healer, suddenly breaking free from the grip, immediately ran away from this cursed temple. Of course, the newly minted novice could not understand at all what had suddenly happened to the Taoist. They had just arrived, and he was already rushing to run away as if death itself was chasing him. In the end, the hero tried to explain to the puzzled man that he had simply become a bit bored standing there, so he decided to return to his room and continue reading the sacred texts. In fact, the young man panicked a lot when leaving that place. Old Li lied to him when he said that because of the preparation for the puja, the healer could not freely walk around the temple. But now it became crystal clear. The abbot simply did not want the parishioner to be able to dispel their carefully woven illusion. This meant only one thing. This entire sect was nothing other than a true abode of pure evil. As he ran past all those stone-carved statues, they also began to change horrifically, turning into a bloody mess of flesh. The frightened hero immediately tried to run away, realizing with horror that these creatures were also alive and they had awakened. However, the monsters merged into one mass and continued relentlessly pursuing him through the corridors. No matter how Li Huovan ran or tried to hide from this cursed place, there was no way out. But quite unexpectedly, a Buddhist with a head entirely made of writhing tentacles emerged from around the corner. He politely greeted the parishioner as if nothing unusual was happening. Obviously, the hero was mortally frightened. After all, he was now surrounded on both sides, as if in a trap. If he could not escape, he would have to fight his way through by force. However, the healer needed only one powerful strike with his sword, and in the end, the monstrous monster fell dead without any resistance, collapsing onto the cold ground. The other creatures that pursued him on his heels froze in place in an instant, as if losing an invisible connection. The hero was already glad that this nightmare had finally ended. However, quite unexpectedly, the ground around him began to tremble threateningly and crack. Immediately after this, the temple itself began to collapse with a deafening roar. From there appeared a huge bloody silhouette, at the sight of which it became obvious Li Huowan could never defeat it in an honest fight. He needed to immediately run away from this temple. After all, the monks surely would not allow the ordinary townspeople to see this disgusting thing. But the healer felt that this bloody fiend represented the true, unmasked face of that venerable Buddha to whom they all fervently prayed. In the end, he continued to desperately flee until he saw the sect leader himself blocking the way. However, the young man could not allow the man to stop him, so he immediately swung his sword to force his way to freedom. But the monk calmly recited some ancient mantra to soothe the soul, and in the end, everything around instantly quieted down, as if time had stopped, and the hero's sword vanished without a trace right from his hands, dissolving into the air. Of course, the healer immediately looked around fearfully, desperately trying to understand how the monk managed such sorcery. However, he calmly explained to the parishioner that all his 6 senses were clouded by illusion. Therefore, it was better for the young man to refrain from using weapons. They were useless in this place anyway. Immediately after this, many monks rushed to them, surrounding the hero from all sides with a tight ring to prevent him from escaping the temple. Of course, the sect leader was deeply upset by the improper behavior of his disciples, so he decided to find out what caused such panic and disorder within the sacred walls. And they fearfully reported to their master that the Taoist attacked their elder brother without any provocation. They came running to demand a fair explanation of what happened. And of course, after these outrageous words, the enraged master immediately glared at the hero with a burning gaze. He wanted to know for what reason the parishioner dared to attack one of their devoted followers. Perhaps he treated the guest badly and insulted him. However, Li Huowan angrily demanded that the monk immediately stop pretending to be innocent. He clearly saw all the monstrous things happening inside their so-called holy temple. Even the abbot himself was extremely interested to find out exactly what the hero had seen with his own eyes. Only then did the young man realize with horror that he did not know where that huge monster of flesh and blood had gone, and what was even happening in this god-cursed place. Soon they reached a stone statue, which the hero fiercely attacked in his mad flight. However, it turned out to be just an ordinary stone statue without a single sign of life. Although the healer solemnly claimed that they had turned into fleshy, amorphous monsters and were chasing him on his heels. The monk even allowed the hero to personally feel this stone, which he had split in 2. And to the touch, it really was just an ordinary, cold stone, no flesh at all. The sect leader politely suggested the young man continue a careful inspection of other places. After that, they arrived at the very temple from which the healer had fled so fearfully, saving his life. Looking at the majestic statue, The leader assumed that this was the very terrifying monster the parishioner had seen with his clouded mind. However, looking at the golden statue, the hero could not believe his eyes. It really was just a golden statue of a four-armed Buddha in a prayer pose. But Li Huawen saw here precisely a bloodthirsty monster made of flesh. He was absolutely sure. Of course, the young man panicked, not understanding at all what he had seen with his own eyes. Was it truth or an illusion? However, the monk gently reminded him that the hero knows his own mental illness better than they do. Strangers to him who do not know his history. Of course, the guy was very worried, because he perfectly understood. Perhaps those black pills he had taken gave him not much time of clear mind. The other monks were finally convinced of the hero's madness. They strongly wished for him to leave the temple as soon as possible before he caused even greater troubles. Otherwise, what if he lost control again and harmed someone? The sect leader himself coldly understood. If Li Huawen had another outburst of rage, it would not be such a big problem for them. But if he disturbed their venerable god again with his actions, that would be an extremely unpleasant incident. Therefore, the abbot suggested that Li Huawen make amends for all the caused disorder with an offering. He gave the healer incense so that he could present it with apologies to all the venerable Buddhas. When the hero did not immediately accept the offering, the monk became obviously curious why the parishioner still hesitated and delayed. However, the healer did not want to delve into this slippery question, so he immediately took 3 thin sticks of incense into his trembling hands. In fact, he perfectly understood. All this was a lie. Everything he saw here was the absolute truth. Praying for show, the healer hurried to leave, realizing that everything he now saw around him was a carefully woven illusion, including these obedient disciples and harmless stone statues. Apparently, the monks naively think they can fool his heightened senses with their spells. However, the hero had been wandering between reality and illusion for so many cursed years that he had long learned to unmistakably distinguish truth from skillful lies. But obviously it was categorically impossible to stay any longer in this sinister sect. And not only in the sect, he needed to immediately run away from the entire cursed city before it was too late. Soon the healer appeared at the inn, where the worried Bai Lin Miao was anxiously waiting for him. The girl was extremely surprised that her elder brother had finished his important business at the temple so early. However, he anxiously demanded that she pack her meager belongings as quickly as possible. After all, they needed to leave this city immediately without losing a moment. Of course, Bai Lin Miao obediently agreed and immediately jumped up from her seat. But she warned that Head Liu and their other companions had just left somewhere on their own errands. To their great regret, they simply could not wait for their return. They had to leave right now. And it was also necessary to urgently send a message through Gu Wu so that the others would hurry. They all needed to leave the city immediately before the monks realized. At that very moment, the sect leader was carefully examining the little child in his chambers. They were very lucky to find this girl. Otherwise, the child's father would have drowned her in the cold river as an unnecessary burden. At that time, a worried monk ran to report troubling news to his master. Li Huawen had indeed escaped from the temple despite all measures. However, the abbot was not surprised by this fact in the slightest, considering that the Tao of the 5 empty skandhas could not deceive his sharpened senses or cloud his mind. After that, the leader asked his assistant to come closer, and ordered to strike the sacred gong. Immediately after that, the abbot recited a special prayer, and at once a red thread with golden beads strung on it appeared around them in the air. The longer the sinister prayer echoed through the air, the more this mystical thread entwined around the helpless body of the child, and gradually it squeezed her fragile flesh like a noose. In the end, with a piercing death scream, the baby's body was mercilessly crushed by this red thread. All this monstrous act was done solely so that the girl would become Buddha's bloody sacrifice to achieve the coveted immortality. Immediately after the ritual, all the contents flowing from the mutilated child's body were carefully enclosed in a ceremonial vase. The head then ordered his devoted disciple to immediately return for the escaped hero. Since the abbot could not come to terms with his sudden departure, the healer must be brought back at any cost. However, looking at yet another doll made from children's flesh, the master asked the disciple to exercise extreme caution in this matter. When the novice left to carry out the order, the abbot went to his secret storage. There stood many of these blood-stained vases with the remains of children inside, a whole collection of innocent victims. Placing another one in its place in the row, the monk, honestly speaking, envied that old man Dan. He was incredibly lucky to find such a sincere and talented disciple. At that very moment, the fugitives' camp was set up in a dense forest, far from the city walls. Guva was preparing simple food over the fire and immediately offered his younger sister to taste the noodles. After all, they were made especially for her. However, when Bai Lin Miao refused the treat, Guva immediately understood, apparently. The girl was very worried about her older brother. She was anxious because he had hurriedly led them out of the city, and now he had left them here alone, having gone somewhere unknown. However, Guva perfectly understood that Li Huowan would never leave them in mortal danger without a good reason. Surely the healer decided that they would not hinder him in the upcoming battle. Therefore, he ordered them to hide here, far from the city. And obviously, Bai Lin Miao herself was fully aware of everything deep in her soul. But this did not make her feel any calmer. Anxiety was tearing at her heart. In fact, Gu Wu did not want to upset the girl and speak harshly about the fact that they would only be a burden to the hero in a real battle. However, he was simply trying to stop her from reckless attempts to go looking for their older brother alone. But at that anxious moment, all those who had fled from the mad old man heard a loud, deafening sound near their camp. When a powerful explosion shook the air, Gu Wu immediately thought that perhaps their older brother was desperately fighting someone. Bai Lin Miao rushed headlong towards the sound, worried that her brother was in mortal danger. She desperately wanted to help him no matter the cost. Of course, Gu Wu reminded the girl that they were too weak and fragile. They could not help the healer in battle. And she knew all this perfectly well deep in her heart. She also realized that if it were not for the constant help of their older brother, they would have long ago died in this cruel world. They owed him their lives, every breath. Therefore, Bai Lin Miao had to see him, at least one last time. After all, if the older brother died in this fight, there would be no point in continuing to live in this merciless world. Meanwhile, the hero secluded himself deep in the forest, examining his numerous wounds. Then he bitterly realized that his current strength was completely insufficient to feel confident in this strange, dangerous new world. He needed to become much stronger, otherwise death was inevitable. Obviously, if even such a social outcast as the mad old man managed to gain incredible power, then the healer could do it too. But the hero could not understand where he could get this coveted power. However, quite unexpectedly, he heard the familiar mocking voice of the late teacher. He urged the hero to steal power from others if he could not obtain it himself, if he could not steal it, take it by force, or outwit as a last hope. Immediately after these ominous words, the young man's face began to change and distort terribly. It doubled half of the wrinkled visage of his mad master alchemist appeared instead of his face. Of course, the hero immediately fell to the ground in fear, desperately trying to get rid of this terrifying illusion. However, quite unexpectedly, he heard the monotonous prayer of the people from the cursed sect who came after him on his heels. At that moment, the monks surrounded the healer from all sides, tightly encircling him and not letting him escape into the thicket. And that very monk, who once brought the hero to the sect master, was completely transformed. His appearance was distorted beyond recognition. However, there was a terrible feeling as if only one single hero noticed this while retreating backward. The healer finally understood with crystal clarity that these degenerates were praying to real monstrous monsters. After that, he loudly called the Master Yu for help. After all, these creatures had already stopped pretending to be harmless people. The Buddhist pretended not to understand at all what the hero was so excitedly talking about. At that very moment, Master Yu was already biting into the monk's hand with sharp teeth. In the end, he hastily managed to devour this bloodied limb down to the root, to the bone. That dreadful moment was enough for the healer to grab the dirt lying on the ground underfoot. Immediately after that, he desperately asked the chief to help him. The young man was ready to give them a whole year of his precious life. At that moment, the monk was calmly trying to explain the harsh truth to the hero. He had taken with him the cursed karma of his late master. If the healer leaves this sacred place, he will bring great pain and suffering to the defenseless world, so it would be much better for the young man to return to the temple voluntarily. However, Li Huovan coldly suggested to the monk to return to the sect on his own, for he did not at all wish to accompany the monster on this journey. Immediately after these bold words, the servant began to recite his sinister prayer. And suddenly the world around began to rapidly change and distort. Now the sword, which the hero was firmly holding in his hands, suddenly turned into a severed bloody palm that gripped his wrist with a deathly grasp. Of course, the guy immediately threw his cursed weapon away from himself with disgust. However, the young man panicked quite a bit. Not only had he lost his only weapon, but his master Yu was clearly struggling to cope with the terrifying influence of this monster. After that, hands made of raw flesh and scarlet blood began to emerge from the ground. Apparently, it was a special technique skillfully used by the monks of their sect. So one thing became obvious. Without having a bell with him, Li Huovan could no longer win. The monk politely asked the hero to immediately stop doing foolish things and not stray from his true path. And it would be even better for everyone if the healer humbly returned with them to the temple. However, the hero was not going to go anywhere with these creatures. Moreover, he believed that people who were so devoted to their perverted ideas would be better off just letting him go. After all, the followers of this sect must strictly have a heart full of sincere compassion. Despite this outwardly calm conversation, the healer was only trying to distract the enemy with empty words, for he perfectly understood that he could not defeat him in an honest fight. The young man had to escape from here at all costs, and for that, he needed to wait and find a convenient moment to flee. However, quite unexpectedly, when the monster was pondering a heart full of compassion, some sharp, writhing tentacles began to creep ominously out of its back. Like metallic blades, they immediately rushed at the hero, trying to pierce him from all sides at once. The monk calmly explained to the parishioner that his heart was indeed full of compassion. That was exactly the main reason why he could not allow the hero to go to certain death. Immediately after that, a bloody thick mass began to envelop the young man from all sides, like a shroud. The healer demanded that the monster stop immediately. However, it had no intention of doing so and continued the attack. Even if Li Huowan had been injured and could no longer walk on his own will, the monk would simply have carried him back to the temple in his arms. Obviously feeling the icy breath of death on his neck, the hero immediately shouted at the top of his lungs, demanding that the monster stop attacking him at once. And at this critical moment, bluish energy burst out from his body. Exactly the same as that of the mad master who protected his disciple. Frightened by it, the monk immediately asked the hero to stop, as he did not want to harm him at all. After that, he finally released the healer, allowing Li Huowan to get up from the ground. So the guy could only lie in the sticky blood and wonder why the monster suddenly panicked so much. Meanwhile, the monk asked the hero to calmly have a heart-to-heart talk. The servant was sincerely convinced that he would understand his good intentions and voluntarily return to the temple together. Rising from the ground, the hero decided to support this conversation, still wondering to himself, why did the creature, many times stronger than him, so persistently persuade and still not kill him on the spot? The monk himself explained that he considered the parishioner a just man with a pure soul, with whom it was surely possible to reach a peaceful agreement. Now the situation was unfolding exactly as it had in the temple. Although the sect leader possessed unimaginable power, he did not finish off the healer. He decided to try to deceive and persuade him. Realizing this, the young man understood. The monk would not allow him to die, including not allowing anything serious to threaten the hero's life. Surely they had long understood that as soon as his life was in danger, his master, Dan Yangzi, would always appear to protect his beloved disciple. Apparently, they were mortally afraid of him, this madman. However, this assumption only deeply offended the monk to the core. Their almighty sect could not be afraid of someone like this pathetic, crazy old man. Therefore, he angrily ordered the hero to immediately stop such fabrications. Nevertheless, listening to his furious words, the healer realized having such a powerful master was sometimes quite useful. After all, the madman had been his teacher for many years. It would be true blasphemy to simply get rid of him as if he were an unnecessary thing. Of course, the monk desperately tried to explain the harsh truth to the hero. His crazy master troubled and threatened not only the young man himself, he posed a danger to all living things. However, Li Huowan coldly suggested saying this to his master's face if the monk was so brave. Naturally, the servant was horrified upon hearing these insane words, having no idea what the healer intended to do. But he resolutely pressed the sword to his own throat, realizing that if the monks wanted to say something, it was better to do it directly to his teacher. Immediately after this, the young man cold-bloodedly slit his own throat with a sharp blade and fell to the ground, rapidly losing consciousness from blood loss. And from the misty skies appeared his late teacher, who came to the aid of his little student. And the healer sighed with great relief, rejoicing that the mentor, as he had thought, really came at the call. Bai Lin Miao was rushing through the forest in desperate search. However, she could not at all understand where exactly that deafening explosion had occurred. Fortunately, Gua remembered the path well when he saw a bright flash and smoke coming from there. Soon he called his younger sister, having heard some strange, frightening sound nearby. When they arrived at the place, they saw the older brother, who was completely covered in his own blood. He was eating some raw flesh hanging from his lips. Of course, the frightened Bai Lin Miao immediately covered her mouth with her palm so as not to reveal her disgust and horror, and she bitterly cried, unable to hold back tears. Soon the whole motley company reached the border town of Nanping. Since none of them had proper documents with them, Gua approached the guard and handed him some copper coins as a bribe. In the end, the guard looked mockingly at the ragged people but still let them through the gates, asking them to hurry into the city. With this generous bribe, Gua proved to Bai Lin Miao that there is no problem in the world that ringing silver could not solve. However, because their group was too large, the officer charged them double the fee for passage. Of course, the girl was frightened, realizing that they were charged a whole 100 grams of silver for the pass. This meant that now they only had enough money for one meager month of existence. However, the hero asked his companions not to worry needlessly. The most important thing was to get out of that cursed place alive. Of course, Gova, immediately seeing the hero lying in the cart, obediently nodded in agreement, and Bai Lin Miao rushed to the wagon to check on the condition of her older brother. The guy was completely covered in bloody wounds and had split cheeks, but he asked the girl not to worry about him so much. The healer decided to ask her about that night when she came for him in the forest. What exactly happened there? However, when Bai Lin Miao arrived at the place, Li Huowan was there completely alone, like a ghost. There was no one nearby, neither living nor dead. Apparently, they also did not see the ghostly teacher with their own eyes. Therefore, the hero decided to find out if they heard sounds resembling thunderclaps or explosions. But to great regret, the girl was so frightened that night that she simply could not recall such details. Therefore, it quickly became clear to the healer he could not rely solely on his mental illness in the fight against these perverted Buddhists. After that, Li Huowan decided to cautiously ask the girl, had his character changed since they left the cursed temple? However, Bai Lin Miao noticed no noticeable changes, and she did not understand the strangeness of this troubling question. However, Li Huowan was simply mortally worried that his ghost teacher wished to use his living body for reincarnation. The fact remained that the young man absolutely could not return to the temple to deal with the old man once and for all. He needed to find other sects in this dangerous world to get help. However, the healer noticed how worried Bai Lin Miao was, who had been guarding him all this time. Therefore, he hurried to take her hand and explained that she had nothing to worry about so much. The girl could calm down and leave all the problems to him. He would definitely handle everything. No matter how dangerous the enemies were, the healer had to deal with these problems for everyone's sake. Finally, when night came and the stars lit up in the sky, the whole group stopped in the forest to set up camp. Leader Liu warned that after they left the Nanping Mountains, the travelers would be on the border of Sichuan province, and the healer decided to find out. Did the captives have relatives here? After all, they could finally return to their native homes. It turned out that the home of one of the young men was exactly on the territory of Sichuan. Therefore, the hero asked the boy to tell them what kind of country it was. Were there large sects there, for example, ones as sinister as the Buddhist one? However, although the young man was not born in those parts, he had never left his native village before the kidnapping. Only when he was 9 years old did he see a strange man at the edge of the village talking to spirits. On the day that man came to their village, one of the residents was struck by a strange, terrible leprosy. The unfortunate one ran on all fours on the ground and barked like a mad dog. After the spirit talker met with that unfortunate man, the very next day everything returned to normal. That man was even able to calmly go to work as if nothing strange had happened at all. Interested in this curious story, the hero decided to find out. Was there some special sect or a gathering place for mediums in their village? However, the boy had only overheard that all who speak with spirits live in special houses. After all, they must honor their immortal patrons. Hearing this, the healer decided to inquire further. What exactly are these mysterious immortals? And the boy pondered, straining his memory and recalling their names. However, quite unexpectedly, a traveler who came from the forest explained that the great immortals are the red, yellow, white, and willow seals. The fugitives got nervous when they saw the uninvited traveler in the night. Therefore, they immediately became alert and grabbed the nearest weapons, preparing for a fight. However, the stranger himself hastened to calm the alarmed crowd. After all, he was not an enemy to them at all. The man made it clear that he had been traveling at night, saw their cozy fire, and decided to come warm himself. And he accidentally overheard their conversation about those who speak with spirits. Moreover, surprisingly, it so happened that he himself was a modest medium who spoke with those very spirits. And indeed, when the boy looked closely at the newcomer, he recognized his distinctive attire. It really was the traditional garb of one who speaks with spirits. However, the healer stared intently at the man, peering at what was behind his back. It was a ghostly spirit, unseen by any other mortal. Therefore, seeing the hero's attentive gaze, the medium thought the boy did not believe him at his word, and he decided to give him a small, convincing demonstration of his abilities. After that, he took out his musical instruments and immediately began dancing around the fire, summoning the spirits to come at his call. However, the hero immediately armed himself just in case with his copper bell and the blade of his fallen comrade. Right after that, the healer rang the bell, driving away the spirit that stood behind the man, away from them. After that, he decisively pointed the sword at the medium, as if warning him that it was better to immediately stop doing anything strange in their camp. When the hero pointed his sword at the man's neck, he was immediately stopped by a formidable spirit in red robes that appeared behind his back. Then Li Huowan demanded an explanation of what kind of creature the spirit talker decided to summon without permission. From these words, the man made an unmistakable conclusion that Li Huowan was not originally from Sichuan province. And he explained that he simply wanted to demonstrate to him what a real spirit talker is capable of. However, the healer asked the man not to perform such rituals in the middle of the dead of night. After all, people might misunderstand him and take him for an enemy. After that, he let the medium go in peace, allowing him to leave calmly. As soon as the danger passed, the hands of the spirit that protected the talker immediately returned to normal and disappeared. Before leaving, the man introduced himself once again and said goodbye to the guys, feeling that they could definitely meet again. The boy, as soon as the guest left, warned the hero of an important detail. Next time, he should pay attention to the drums. To summon spirits, the talkers struck the sacred drum. However, quite unexpectedly, Bai Lin Miao, staring at the silhouette of the departing man, saw that spirit in red robes, who was looking straight at her with a piercing gaze. Finally, the next morning came, illuminating the forest with dawn light. So, putting on new clothing, the hero set out on the further journey. But what surprised him the most was that the mouth completely cut open yesterday healed incredibly fast, leaving not a single scar. However, what worried the healer more was that when he asked everyone to be on guard that night, they still called the spirit talker to them and even fed him to fullness. It turned out that he came at dawn, gave Bai Lin Miao his drum, sat down comfortably, and began brazenly begging them for noodles. The medium himself admitted that after leaving, he thought for a long time about the misunderstanding that happened with the hero, and he realized that most likely he had scared him with his actions. Therefore, he came to apologize to the healer for what happened last night. Immediately after this, he politely bowed and went to get himself another generous bowl of fragrant noodles. Bai Lin Miao was extremely worried about the strange man who had arrived and even suggested driving him away from their camp. However, the hero clearly understood that there was no need for that, as he would be able to keep track of this man and his intentions. Therefore, Bai Lin Miao immediately guessed that Li Huowan wanted to use the powers of the spirit speaking for his own purposes, and the girl was very sorry that she was so useless and could not help him in this matter. However, the hero only gently tousled her hair with tenderness and offered to teach the girl how to use the bell if she so much wanted to be helpful. After that, they continued their journey along the dusty road. Already on the way, the hero told that they, with such a large, motley group, were moving towards the kingdom of Liang. The one speaking with the spirits was moving towards his third grandmother, who would soon have a birthday celebration. He wanted to arrive early to congratulate her first, ahead of all the relatives. After that, a long, awkward silence ensued, and the healer decided to find out what exactly the man was doing while speaking with spirits. It turned out his specialization was exorcising evil and healing serious illnesses, changing fates and attracting wealth, weddings, funerals, fortune-telling, anything the soul desired. However, each immortal possesses different abilities. Therefore, even if the summoned immortal could not handle the task, another more powerful one could be invited. However, the medium was extremely curious why the hero was interested in someone like him, with so many questions. However, Li Huowan hastened to explain to the man that he merely wished to learn more about this art out of pure curiosity. Therefore, the speaker explained that not everyone can actually become a medium. For this, a special ability granted from above is needed. First, one must contract a serious illness, preferably one that brings a person close to death. If lucky, the immortal will send a message in a dream and cure the ailment. And finally, as a reward, he becomes a speaker with spirits. However, being one of these spirit speakers is not so easy. Too many dishonorable deeds must be committed, and one must constantly face 3 calamities and 8 misfortunes. And after all this, you only receive a meager 50 copper coins for the work. Simply put, a spirit speaker is a long-term slave of the immortal. So these 50 coppers are just a tip. This is an old tradition that has lasted more than 300 years. Mediums do not need such useless things. And although the healer was extremely curious about what the immortal really needed, the spirit speaker could not properly talk about it, but definitely not things like money and earthly riches. After that, the medium decided to find out when dinner time would come. However, judging by the sun, it was still very far away. For some reason, during the conversation, Li Huowan had a strong feeling that the immortals accompanying the speaker were capable of worthy resistance against his crazy old ghost. Exactly what the immortal would want in return, no one knew for sure. However, suddenly Bai Lin Miao, completely out of breath and tired, approached the hero. She suggested to her older brother to take a short break on the way. Obviously, the healer immediately noticed that her face had become very red from the heat, and the girl explained that she was tired after a long journey, after which she lost consciousness, collapsing onto the cold ground. Already at night, they stopped at some house where the hero put the girl to sleep. She had a high fever that did not subside. Moreover, Bai Lin Miao kept deliriously mumbling something unintelligible in her sleep. At that time, the young man returned, who asked the villagers about what the elder brother had requested. However, the information matched what the spirit medium told them. They found themselves in a village located near the town of Banjegu. The journey there will take about 20 days on foot. That is where the next place was, where they could calmly sleep and have a good rest. Moreover, the guy found out that the spirit medium was going to perform a ritual for a family from the village. It seemed that the family in the east of the village was under the harmful influence of an evil spirit. Therefore, Gova and the others went with the medium to accompany him. Obviously, Li Huowan asked the young man to look after Bai Lin Miao, After all, he himself also needed to go there, to the east of the village. However, the young man asked that the elder brother not go anywhere. It was better to wait until the spirit medium returned, and they could ask him to examine Bai Lin Miao. The hero promised that he would resolve everything when he saw this person in action with his own eyes. In the end, he soon joined the crowd of curious onlookers, and seeing Gu Wu, he decided to find out who was possessed by the evil spirit. It turned out to be a young girl who was being forcibly restrained right in the courtyard of the house because she behaved simply inadequately, as if insane. The man begged the spirit medium to save his unfortunate bride, and since the medium had received money for the job, he simply had no choice. However, the man was actually worried, because initially he thought the girl had been given the wrong medicine. But he was very glad when he saw the young Taoist in the crowd, and immediately invited him to come closer. He also wished for the young man to help him with the ritual. And after the exorcism was over, they could ask for a bigger reward and split it fairly in half. 50-50. However, the young man was little interested in money. He did not need it at all. Moreover, he asked the medium to hurry. This unfortunate woman looked as if she was trying to break all her bones at once. In the end, the spirit medium had no choice left. Therefore, he only asked Li Huan to watch him carefully during the ritual. After that, the medium began to beat the sacred drums and dance, addressing the great immortal. Immediately after he began to dance fervently, a spirit resembling a snake left the girl's body. So, it turns out this family was very lucky to have turned to the spirit speaker. After all, they probably wouldn't have managed without the proper exorcism ritual. At that time, the head of the family was kneeling nearby and continued to pray to the great immortal for the protection of his family. When the spirit speaker lit the incense stick, the spirit that had been beside him all this time finally revealed its true face. After that, two forces, the demonic one in the girl and the power of the great spirit, fiercely clashed. While the ritual was being performed, the smoke grew thicker and thicker, obscuring everything around. Moreover, it was heard that the spirit speaker called not just one immortal for help. However, quite unexpectedly, the snake spirit realized it could not defeat the powerful immortal in a fair fight. So it immediately tried to find a new defenseless victim. For some reason, it chose the hero as the weakest victim and targeted him. However, the guy also rang his bell, not allowing this monster to come closer to him. In the end, the exorcism continued. The spirit was finally completely drawn out of the girl and was absorbed by the immortal himself as nourishing food. Only after that did the spirit speaker come out of the trance. He apologized to Li Huan for not being able to help him in the fight. After all, during the sacred ritual, he had to be as focused as possible on the summoning.